The fifth generation of Pokémon carried something different from the very beginning. When Pokémon Black and White arrived, they brought with them a region unlike any that had come before, a place called Unova, designed from the ground up to feel modern, dense, and alive. And before we drift any further into this quiet world, please subscribe to join the Cozy Club for more videos like this, and let me know where you are watching from tonight. Unova was the first region in the series to introduce an entirely new set of Pokémon before revealing any returning faces, a bold and deliberate choice that shaped everything that followed. There is something worth sitting with in that decision. Unova's roster of 156 creatures remains the largest ever introduced in a single generation. Each one arrived with its own quiet story, its own layered meaning, its own thread connecting it to something real in the world. These are those stories, told slowly, one by one, beneath the stillness of wherever you are tonight. Victini holds a particular place in the Unova Pokedex because it occupies entry number 0. Every regional Pokedex begins somewhere, and Unova chose to begin before one. Victini was placed at the very start, a mythical Pokémon positioned before the starters themselves, a small and luminous creature whose very shape was built around a single letter. The letter V. It carries that shape in its ears, in its gestures, in the way it seems to hold itself with quiet certainty. The vow is not only for victory, though that meaning is present and intentional. The vow also stands for 5, rendered in Roman numerals. Victini arrived in the 5th generation, and its designers embedded that fact into the creature's silhouette, hiding meaning in form the way the best designs always do. Junichi Masuda, one of the series' most significant creative voices, has spoken publicly about Victini being his personal favorite Pokémon from this generation, a rare kind of declaration that suggests something personal was woven into its creation. What makes that affection worth considering is how much Victini communicates through stillness. It does not look powerful in the way that late-game legendaries often do. It looks gentle. Its Pokedex entries describe a creature that brings good fortune to whoever it encounters, that can share its limitless energy with those around it. There is something in that concept that lingers long after the game is finished. A small, mythical thing that exists primarily to help others, carrying within it enough warmth to sustain any journey. Victini arrived at the beginning because it belongs at the beginning. A quiet promise made before anything else has started. The starters of Unova arrived as they always do, 3 small creatures standing at the threshold of an adventure, each one a different element, each one a different kind of beginning. Snivy was the grass type, a small green Pokémon with a manner that seemed to suggest it already knew exactly what was going to happen. When Snivy was first shown to international audiences without its English name attached, players began inventing names for it on their own. One of those invented names, a fan creation called Smuglev, spread far enough and fast enough that it was mentioned in official Nintendo magazine publications in both Australia and the United Kingdom. That a nickname invented by players made its way into licensed editorial coverage speaks to something about Snivy's design, something in its posture and expression that communicated a particular personality so clearly that strangers halfway around the world arrived at the same word to describe it. Ken Sugimori, who has guided the visual identity of Pokémon through decades of design evolution, has spoken about Snivy and its evolutionary relatives being rooted in the imagery of French royalty. That influence is not obvious at first, but it becomes clearer the longer you sit with Serperior's long, elegant form, the way it carries itself above the ground, the regal stillness in its proportions. What makes this detail particularly layered is that several other Unova Pokémon were also drawing from French cultural imagery, and the generation that followed Unova was built entirely around a region inspired by France. The seeds of Kalos may have been planted quietly and without announcement in the design notes for Snivy's line. Superior found its way into the Pokemon Adventures manga, carried by multiple characters over the course of the story, passing between trainers, the way certain Pokemon seem to drift toward wherever they are most needed. The Superior in those pages had a nickname, and that nickname came from the Japanese words for vine and snake, layered together in the way that makes a nickname feel less like a label and more like a description of the creature itself. It is the kind of detail that players who look closely tend to find, a small reward for attention paid in a quiet moment. Tepig arrived as the fire-type starter, small and round and warm, carrying within it the beginning of what would become Embor. Tepig's German name is Floink. That is its entire name in that language. Floink. There is something unexpectedly delightful in that simplicity, a name that sounds like the noise a small pig might make landing softly on something. Ken Sugimori has noted that the Tepig evolutionary line was designed in a style informed by Chinese visual tradition, and that detail connects to a long-standing fan observation that the fire-type starters across the series draw from the animals of the Chinese zodiac. Whether that pattern was always intentional or emerged through creative coincidence is something that remains open, but the fact that Sugimori acknowledged a Chinese design influence in Embor's line suggests that the connection was not accidental. Pignite was another fan-invented name that circulated before any official naming was announced. Players proposed Pignite as a possible English name for Tepig's first evolution, and when the official name was eventually revealed, it matched what fans had imagined almost exactly. That convergence between fan expectation and official decision happens rarely, and when it does, it suggests that the design communicates something so clearly that independent minds arrive at the same language to describe it. Oshawott came to players as the water-type starter of Unova, a small creature with a round face and a shell worn on its belly like a miniature shield. The team that designed Oshawott and its evolutions found their way to the final concept through something as grounded and unhurried as a trip to an aquarium. According to Sugimori, the design process for this line was the most difficult of the three Unova starter families. The team sat with the problem for a long time before the visit to the aquarium gave them what they needed. Sea lions and otters emerged from that experience, and those two animals became the foundation that Duat and Samurott were eventually built upon. Samurott holds a quiet record within the starter families. Its cry, the sound it makes when it enters battle, is the longest of any starter Pokemon, stretching to just over 2 full seconds. That number, precise and unassuming, carries within it something about Samurott's character, a creature that takes its time, that does not rush, that sounds its presence in the world without hurry, and then settles into whatever comes next. Duat's name arrives layered with meaning in a way that feels almost like a puzzle. Du for water, Wat for otter. But there is a third thread tucked inside, because Helen DeWitt, the author of the novel The Last Samurai, shares a last name that nearly mirrors Duat's name in spelling. Duat's evolutionary line draws from samurai imagery, and whether the naming overlap was a deliberate tribute or a beautiful accident, it remains one of those small details that rewards the kind of slow, careful attention that nighttime tends to make easier. Patrat arrived as Unova's regional rodent, carrying the long tradition of small early root scout Pokemon that each generation tends to introduce. But the parallel between Patrat and Sentret, the regional rodent of Johto, runs deeper than surface resemblance. Both creatures carry the species designation of scout Pokemon. Both are described in their lore as creatures defined by watchfulness, by a sense of vigilance. Sentret watches from the air, alert to threats arriving from above. Patrat keeps watch from the ground, scanning the terrain ahead. They are the same idea expressed in different animals, a fact that speaks to the way Unova's designers were consciously in conversation with the generations that preceded them. Watchog, Patrat's final evolution, holds a small statistical distinction that is easy to overlook. It is the only evolved Pokémon in the entire series to carry a catch rate of 255, the highest possible value. A catch rate that high means the Pokémon makes itself available to capture as openly and easily as any wild creature can. There is something almost generous in that number, a fully evolved creature extending itself without resistance. Lillipup presented itself to the players of Black and White as a small dog with a calm and confident bearing. Its Pokedex entry in the Sun games mentions that its silence in difficult moments, its tendency not to yelp or cry out, has made it particularly well loved by trainers living in apartment buildings. The detail is specific in a way that feels like a small, quiet nod from the design team to the players who had grown up with the series and were now living the particular life that apartments represent. Sherdier, which Lillipup evolves into, carries a design rooted in the Yorkshire Terrier, a breed developed in England no earlier than the 19th century. Yet an Ultramoon Pokedex entry claims that images of Herdier can be found painted on cave walls from long, long ago. That tension between the breed's documented history and the implied ancient companionship between Herdier and humans is not a mistake so much as a creative choice, a way of suggesting that this creature's relationship with people runs deeper than any record can reach. Stoutland completes the line as a large, warm, profoundly loyal companion. Its Ultra-Sun entry notes that its coat protects it so thoroughly from cold that low temperatures bring it no discomfort at all. That detail sits differently against the context of Stoutland's appearances in the Sun and Moon anime, where the creature plays a role so tender and so quietly devastating that players who encountered it there found themselves returning to even a simple Pokedex entry with new feeling. Purloin carries its design in its name with a degree of transparency that is almost its own form of cleverness. The word purloin is simply the English verb to purloin, meaning to steal something, with the R doubled so that the word also contains the purr that a cat makes. A thieving cat whose name sounds like theft and like a cat simultaneously. The design communicates everything about itself through the title alone. Leopard Purloin's evolution holds a quieter footnote. An episode of the Black and White anime was prepared that would have marked Leopard's debut, but a natural disaster, the Tohoku earthquake and tsunami, caused that episode to be postponed and ultimately canceled. Leopard did not appear in the anime until nearly 100 episodes later than originally planned, arriving quietly long after the moment that had been prepared for it. Pansage appeared to the world in toy form before it appeared anywhere officially. An image of a Pansage toy began circulating online in the summer of 2010, showing a small monkey with a leafy head and a vaguely pudgy silhouette. That image generated speculation, got caught up in a promotional leak that turned out to be fabricated and then was eventually confirmed when Pansage was officially revealed on the Pokemon Sunday show. The small gap between the leaked toy and the official announcement is the kind of compressed timeline that feels, in retrospect, like a single breath held and released. Simisage, Pansage's evolution, carries a Japanese name that likely descends from the word Yankee, used to describe an American person. That would make Simisage one of the few Pokemon whose name contains a geographical cultural reference embedded in a different language, a small and somewhat unlikely piece of geographic self-identification tucked into an evolution of a monkey that carries a leafy bunch on its head. Panpour, the water elemental monkey, completes the trio that together reimagines the old saying of hear no evil, see no evil, speak no evil. Panpour is the one who sees nothing, its eyes closed in a way that feels less like blindness and more like chosen serenity. The three elemental monkeys were designed as a unit, each one carrying a third of an ancient adage, and placing that folk wisdom into the bodies of small Pokémon suggests a kind of playfulness in the design team, a willingness to see classic human ideas through the lens of creatures that live in forests and mountains. Panpour's design was updated after it was officially revealed. Earlier official artwork showed its tail as entirely blue rather than tan with a blue tip, a small revision that went mostly unnoticed, but that represents the kind of quiet refinement that happens between a design's first public appearance and the version that ends up printed on trading cards and embroidered on promotional merchandise. Munna was a Pokémon whose existence had been hinted at in the games long before it arrived. In the original Red and Blue, a trainer on Route 10 mentions wishing for a pink Pokémon with a floral pattern. In Ruby and Sapphire, a character in the Devon Corporation building describes wanting to build a machine that could reproduce the visual content of Pokémon dreams. Munna arrived in Generation 5 and satisfied both references simultaneously, a pink, flower-patterned creature whose signature ability involves producing and consuming the dream mist that surrounds sleeping Pokémon. The fact that those references existed across multiple earlier games, waiting without impatience for the creature they described, gives Munna an unusual relationship to time within the series. Musharna, Munna's evolution, completes the line, but it does so with a particular mechanical quality worth noting. After Musharna is obtained, and after it has learned the one move it begins with, at level 1, it does not learn any further moves through leveling up. The entire arc of its growth is expressed through that first moment. Whatever Musharna brings to a team is what it brought from the beginning. Pidove introduced Unova's regional bird line, and its Pokedex tells a quiet and slightly melancholy story about intelligence. Pidove, according to official documentation, is unable to follow commands it finds too complicated. If given an instruction that exceeds its comprehension, it simply waits. It stands still in the middle of whatever is happening and waits for a new command, the old one having become too much to hold. There is something patient and also a little heartbreaking in that description, a creature doing its best within its own limits. Tranquil, Pidova's first evolution, carries a Japanese name that traces back through two different sources simultaneously. One source is a Japanese word combining pigeon and a particular texture of feather. The other source is an imaginary ideal world described in the writings of the poet Kenji Miyazawa, a peaceful interior landscape called Ihatov. Tranquil's Pokedex entry in Pokémon White describes a belief held by many people that somewhere deep in the forest, where tranquil rest, there is a place of absolute peace, where conflict does not exist. That description mirrors Miyazawa's invented world, closely enough to suggest the reference was intentional, and the gentle overlap between a fictional utopia and a Pokedex entry written for a pigeon Pokémon carries a quiet tenderness. Unfezant, the final form of this line, carries a small continuity detail across different versions of the story. The trainer Skyla, who appears in the games as a pilot and gym leader, is associated with an Unfezant that is female in the games and in the Pokémon Adventures manga. In the anime, that same Unfezant appears as male. The difference is visible in the designs, because male and female Unfezant look distinctly different, and the inconsistency across different versions of the same story is the kind of small thing that dedicated fans tend to find and hold on to. Blitzel arrived as Unova's early electric-type Pokémon, a striped creature that despite appearing on a relatively accessible early route can only be found in a single location across 2 games. Its evolution, Zebstrika, which one might expect to be harder to encounter given its greater rarity in the wild, can instead be found in 9 different locations across 8 separate games. The inversion of that expected ratio is the kind of small distribution quirk that the game's designers were perhaps not entirely aware of, or perhaps allowed to stand because it was simply interesting. Zebstrika carries the species designation of Thunderbolt Pokémon. That name doubles as the name of one of the most recognized moves in the entire series. The overlap places Zebstrika in a small and unusual group of Pokémon whose species title is identical to the name of an existing attack, a kind of accidental self-definition through vocabulary. Roggenrola arrived as a recently discovered Pokémon, even within the logic of its own world. Its white Pokedex entry states that Roggenrola was first encountered only a century ago, discovered in a fissure that opened during an earthquake. Inside each one was an energy core whose nature remained mysterious. That narrative of recency, of a creature only just now entering human awareness, gives Roggenrola an unusual freshness for a rock type, which tends to suggest ancientness in most designs. Roggenrola feels new, discovered rather than inherited. Boldore shares a remarkable number of qualities with Graveler, the rock-type Pokémon from the original Kanto roster. Both are rock types introduced in odd-numbered generations. Both carry a base stat total of exactly 390. Both evolve from their earlier forms at level 25. Both reach their final evolution through trade. Both, in their shiny forms, lean toward a gentle yellow tone. The parallel is deep enough that it seems unlikely to be accidental, suggesting that Boldore was constructed with Graveler in mind as a template, a conscious echo of an earlier design philosophy. Gigalith, the final form of that line, holds a specific distinction among rock-type Pokémon. It is currently the only pure rock-type Pokémon in its 3rd stage of evolution. The field of rock types is wide and varied, but Gigalith stands alone in that particular intersection of type purity and evolutionary stage. Woobat received a stat increase in Generation 7, making it one of many Pokémon whose numbers were adjusted during that period. But among that group, Woobat was the only unevolved Pokémon to receive an increase. Every other creature adjusted during that update had already reached its final form. Woobat remained in its 1st stage and was still granted additional strength, a small and slightly unusual exception to the pattern. Swoobat's Pokedex entries describe a creature whose sonic waves have 2 distinct effects depending on circumstance. In normal conditions, the ultrasonic emissions from a male Swoobat cause a positive mood shift in anyone nearby, a creature that literally makes the people around it feel better simply by being present. But those same waves are powerful enough to damage concrete. The gap between a creature that generates cheerfulness and a creature capable of structural destruction is wide, and the Pokémon sits comfortably in both descriptions simultaneously. Drillbur holds a visual detail in its shiny form that connects it to Excadrill before evolution typically creates that kind of visual link. In its shiny coloration, Drillbur's color pattern shifts in a way that resembles the regular coloration of Excadrill, rather than a tinted version of its own standard appearance. The shiny form becomes a preview of what the creature will look like when it grows. Excadrill appeared differently in early promotional material for Pokémon Black and White. The version of Excadrill shown in those initial videos had mirrored markings and a notably different body color, leaning toward purple rather than the dark gray of the final version. That earlier Excadrill existed publicly for a period before the final design resolved into the form players would eventually train and battle with. Audino carries a detail in its moveset that is small and circular and somehow pleasing. The first move it learns by leveling up, and the last move it learns by leveling up are identical. Both are last resort, a move that can only be used after every other known move has been tried. Odino arrives with Last Resort waiting at the beginning and waiting again at the end. The symmetry has no practical significance, but it has an aesthetic one. Timber mirrors Machop across multiple dimensions in the same way that Bulldor mirrors Graveler. Both are fighting-type Pokémon, introduced in odd-numbered generations. Both carry a base stat total of 305. Both have a gender ratio weighted 3-to-1 in favor of males. Both appear most commonly in their regions, near construction sites. Both can carry the ability Guts. Both reach their middle evolution through leveling up and their final evolution through trade. And the shiny forms of both Timber and Machop lean toward a similar pale yellow. The pattern is detailed enough that it constitutes a deliberate structural choice, a kind of generational rhyme built into the roster on purpose. Conkeldurr, the final form of that line, is an unusual creature in terms of its design origins. It appears to draw from 3 distinct sources simultaneously and combines them into something that holds together despite that unlikely combination. There is Ogre, from the kind of traditional folklore that imagines large, powerful humanoid creatures in mountain places. There is Construction Worker, supported by its Pokedex description and the concrete blocks it carries. And there is something resembling an elderly figure, suggested by the gray tuft beneath its chin and the way it leans on those concrete blocks as though they were walking canes. 3 very different archetypes, some occupying a single Pokémon. Tympole carries a design that emerged from a word that cannot decide what it means. The Japanese word otamajakushi can refer either to a tadpole or to a musical note. Tympole is both. Its body resembles the shape of a musical note as clearly as it resembles the shape of a tadpole. The visual pun runs so deep that the creature cannot easily be described as primarily one thing or the other. Palpitoad, Tympole's middle evolution, is connected to a numerical coincidence involving the anime. When Ash caught a Palpitoad during the Black and White series, it marked the first time he had caught an already evolved Pokémon since catching a Noctowl 535 episodes earlier. 535 is also the national Pokedex number assigned to Tympole, Palpitoad's pre-evolution. The number that describes how many episodes separated 2 similar events is identical to the Pokedex number of the relevant Pokémon. Whether this was noticed and intended by the writers, or whether it emerged from the sheer density of accumulated Pokémon history, it sits there with the kind of calm improbability that tends to make a fact memorable. Seismitoad, the final form, holds a chemical distinction. It is the only non-poison type Pokémon that can legitimately obtain the ability Poison Touch. Every other creature with that ability belongs to the poison type. Seismitoad exists just outside that boundary, an exception granted by the specific mechanics of how its ability pool was designed. Throw and Sock were designed as a pair and spent time in early development looking considerably different from their final forms. According to comments shared by Ken Sugimori in the Nintendo Dream magazine, Throw and Sock originally resembled Tornadus and Thundurus in their color schemes, both being red and blue, and both also originally had horns that increased the resemblance further. The final designs removed the horns and shifted the visual language towards something more grounded, more directly connected to the martial arts traditions that both Pokémon represent. Sock is connected by its design to a historical figure from the world of martial arts. Mas Oyama, the Korean-Japanese karate master who founded Kyokushin Karate, is considered a primary influence on Sock's design. That kind of specific biographical connection, where a Pokémon is rooted not just in a style but in an identifiable practitioner of that style, gives Sock a particularity that most designs do not carry. Sewaddle was revealed to the world through an unlikely channel. Its first public appearance was on the official Pokemon page of Yahoo. The timing of these early reveals, appearing through unexpected platforms before official announcements were ready, reflects a particular moment in how information traveled in the early years of social media and internet fan culture. A Pokemon appearing on a web portal before it appeared in an official trailer feels like something that could only happen in a specific and narrow window of time. Swadloon, like Musharna before it in this list, is another Pokemon that cannot learn moves by leveling up after its first level. The pattern of creatures frozen at the threshold of growth is unusual, and in Swadloon's case, it connects to the idea of a creature in a transitional state, wrapped in leaves, waiting, becoming something different from what it currently is. Levani's name descends from two sources that happen to align beautifully. The obvious reading is leaves and nanny, suggesting a creature of gentle protective care, but the name also reaches back to Levana, an ancient Roman deity associated with the protection of newborn children, the goddess of that first moment of arrival into the world. A grass-type Pokemon, whose name secretly carries a Roman goddess of new life, is a small and lovely piece of etymology. Venipedi's anime debut carries a continuity complication that arose from real-world events. The episode in which Venipede first appeared involved a stampede of the Pokemon invading a city, and the resolution of the story required characters to travel to a desert location to understand what had driven them. Because two earlier episodes of the anime were cancelled due to the Tohoku disaster, a connecting scene was removed from Venipedi's episode, and the narrator's lines were rewritten to change where the characters were said to be heading. The event left a small seam in the storytelling, visible to those who watch closely. Scolipede grew to become the largest bug-type Pokemon at the time of its introduction, standing at 8 feet and 2 inches in height. It also became the heaviest poison-type Pokemon, carrying a weight of 442 pounds. Those numbers place it in two distinct physical categories simultaneously. A creature that defines that upper boundary of its type in terms of both height and mass. Cottony carries a design detail that is easy to miss. While the cotton appearance is the most obvious element, Cottony is also designed to resemble the head of a sheep, a connection that makes the cotton puff on its body feel like wool rather than plant matter. The design is doing two things at once, being a cotton plant and being an animal, and the overlap between those two ideas is quiet enough that both can be true simultaneously. Whimsicott's Super Smash Bros. For Nintendo 3DS trophy description notes that these creatures enjoy moving furniture around when they sneak into homes. It is a small and charming piece of lore, and also one that is slightly difficult to picture, given that Whimsicott stands 2 feet 4 inches tall and weighs under 15 pounds. Lilligant evolves from Petilil through the use of a Sunstone, and after that evolution, it learns only 4 moves through leveling up past level 1. The narrowness of that range makes the timing of evolution a genuine strategic consideration. A trainer who evolves Petilil too early closes off possibilities, because Lilligant's move pool after evolution is simply small. The design communicates something about elegance through constraint, a beautiful creature that has simplified itself down to a few essential things. Basculin exists in 2 forms, red-striped and blue-striped, and the history of which abilities those forms can access is complicated enough that it became something of an ongoing conversation among players who cared about such specifics. In the original Black and White, both forms shared the same 2 possible abilities. Then a traded version in one game introduced a third. Then the sequel games changed the blue form's ability options while leaving the red form unchanged. Then transferring a specific blue form with a specific ability across a generational boundary changed that ability again. Basculin's ability history reads like a small procedural drama, a creature that cannot quite settle on what it is from one game to the next. Sandile carries a type combination that belongs to no other Pokémon: ground and dark. The pairing existed nowhere in the series before Sandile arrived, and Sandile's evolutionary line remains its only holder. A type combination shared by no one else that gives a creature a kind of solitude within the type chart, a place that only it occupies. Krokorok, Sandile's middle evolution, holds a particular record in the anime. The Krokorok that eventually joined Ash's team was encountered first as a Sandile, and the span of time between that initial encounter and the eventual capture measured 62 episodes. No other Pokémon in the series took longer from first appearance to being caught. The creature was patient, or perhaps it was simply waiting for the right moment. Darumaka's White Pokedex entry describes a practice from an earlier period in the world's history in which people would place Darumaka's droppings inside their clothing to stay warm during cold seasons. The entry presents this as a practical and apparently widespread custom. The warmth generated by Darumaka's internal flame transfers into its waste products with enough persistence that people found them worth carrying. Darmanitan, Darumaka's evolution, burns at an internal temperature of 2,500 degrees Fahrenheit. Its black Pokedex entry states that this energy is sufficient for it to destroy a dump truck with a single punch. That detail arrives just 2 Pokedex entries after Krokorok's claim that its jaw strength can crush the body of an automobile. The juxtaposition of 2 Pokedex entries within the same regional dex, both casually referencing the destruction of motor vehicles, suggests either a preoccupation on the part of the writers or a genuine effort to establish a scale of destructive capability that players could understand by reference to objects they recognized. Maractus grows in the desert. Its design is based on a cactus. Its natural habitat is arid and sun-blasted. And yet Maractus has neither a typing nor an ability that would protect it from being damaged by sandstorm weather. In the desert resort, the only location in Generation 5 where Maractus can be found, a permanent sandstorm is always active. The cactus Pokémon lives in a sandstorm that damages it. The game does not comment on this. Dwebble carries a typing that surprises on first consideration. A hermit crab Pokémon is bug and rock rather than water, despite being based on an aquatic creature. The reasoning embedded in the design comes from biology. Crustaceans, the group that crabs belong to, share a surprisingly close evolutionary relationship with insects, closer in some measurable ways than crabs are to other crustaceans. The bug typing is scientifically more defensible than it initially appears. Crustle, Dwebble's evolution, carries 2 regular abilities, Sturdy and Shell Armor, both of which describe the resilience of its shell. Its hidden ability is Weak Armor. The contrast between the named abilities of its standard slots and the name of the ability it hides is complete enough to function as a small joke. Scraggy is called the Shedding Pokémon, a species title that references the way lizards shed skin. Its Pokedex entries, however, make no reference to shedding. They describe its skin as baggy because it is rubbery and stretchy, not because it sheds. The species title and the Pokedex description do not agree with each other, and the discrepancy sits quietly in the official documentation. Scrafty's anime debut contained a moment preserved in the Latin American dubbing that became notable in a particular way. During an episode in which Meowth attempts to distract the creature, the Latin American voice actor, rather than using a translation of the scripted line, apparently improvised a phrase that roughly translates to, "Holy crap, look over there, there's a Digimon moving." The improvised line referenced a rival franchise in the middle of a Pokémon episode and the fact that this made it into a broadcast dub remains one of those small, improbable moments in animation history. Sigilyph is the only Pokemon capable of having the ability Wonderskin that does not possess it as a hidden ability. Every other Pokemon for which Wonderskin is available receives it through the hidden ability slot. Sigilyph has it as a standard option, accessible without any special breeding or transfer requirements. Yamask carries a name built from several possible origins that stack on top of one another with a kind of semantic richness. Yami in Japanese means darkness. Ya can mean bad. Yama is the Lord of the Dead in Hindu and Buddhist tradition. And then there is the reading that works purely in English, which hears the name as your mask. Because Yamask holds a mask wherever it goes, a mask that according to its Pokedex entries was once a human face, carried from a previous life into whatever existence this one is. The name that sounds like your mask carries the weight of that story without ever needing to explain it. Kofagrigus made its debut in the anime in an episode that also marked the first appearance of the move Mirror Move in animation. Mirror Move is a Generation 1 attack, one of the oldest moves in the series, and it waited until its 721st episode to appear on screen. The pairing of an ancient move with a new Pokemon in that particular episode is the kind of coincidence that is difficult to know whether it was planned. Tortuga may have appeared in promotional material as early as the spring of 1997. In an issue of a Japanese game magazine from that year that announced the upcoming Pokemon Gold and Silver, a creature with significant visual similarities to Tortuga appeared on the cover. Whether it was an early concept for what would eventually become Tortuga, or a genuine ancestor of the design, the image suggests that the ideas that would coalesce into this ancient turtle Pokemon were circulating very early. Caracosta, Tortuga's evolution, appears in Pokemon Super Mystery Dungeon with a line that references one of the more widespread internet phrases of the early 2010s. The quote, "Do not let your dreams just be dreams," which became famous through a particular internet video, found its way into official Pokemon documentation in a way that reads simultaneously as inspirational advice and as a nod toward a cultural moment. Archon and Archeops hold a distinction within the fossil Pokemon family that makes their existence feel particularly constrained. They are the only fossil Pokemon without hidden abilities. While other fossil revived creatures can access alternate ability slots through breeding, Archon and Archeops have no such option. Their single available ability, Defeatist, is also notable for being specifically punishing. When these Pokemon drop below half their health, their attack and special attack are both halved. A creature whose only ability makes it weaker the more it is hurt. Archeops carries a base stat total of 567. Its national Pokedex number is 567. The number that describes its total statistical strength is the same number that identifies it in the national listing. And 567 is also the classification number used in the Dewey Decimal System to categorize books about dinosaurs. 3 identical numbers converging from 3 different systems is the kind of coincidence that makes a fact feel like it was placed there on purpose. Trubbish made its international debut in the opening animation of the Pokemon Black and White anime, before it was formally revealed through any official announcement. Players watching that opening sequence saw Trubbish before they had been told it existed, a reveal through the corner of an image rather than through a press release. Garbodor, Trubbish's final form, became one of the more debated Pokemon designs in its generation, regarded by some players as emblematic of a kind of creative bankruptcy, and by others as a genuinely interesting design idea. Its Japanese name, Dustas, has been read as containing the phrase dust to dust, the middle portion of the older phrase ashes to ashes, dust to dust, which functions in religious and literary tradition as a metaphor for the finality of death. A Pokemon based on a garbage pile whose name may reference mortality is either deeply considered or deeply coincidental. Zorua and Zoroark arrived as event-exclusive Pokemon in a way that had no precedent and has not been repeated. Prior to the release of Black and White 2, the only legitimate way to obtain Zorua and Zoroark in the original Black and White required participation in a special real-world event. They were not legendary Pokemon. They were not mythical Pokemon. They were regular evolutionary relatives presented with legendary exclusivity. Without the event, it was impossible to complete even the standard regional Pokedex. The gate placed around them made completion technically inaccessible to players who could not attend or access the distribution event. Zoroark shares a remarkable number of properties with Lucario, the featured Pokemon of the generation that preceded it. Both served as the central figure in the film released just before their respective games. Both are bipedal Pokemon with a design rooted in canine or canine-adjacent animal inspiration. Both carry identical names in Japanese and English versions of the games. Both have the same gender ratio. Both belong to the same egg group. And both require the same precise number of experience points to reach level 100, that number being 1,059,860. The depth of the parallel suggests that Zoroark was designed in explicit conversation with Lucario, a deliberate echo across generations. Minccino arrived as a small, normal-type creature with a love of cleanliness that runs deep enough to be defined as a central personality trait. Its Pokedex entries describe a Pokemon that cannot tolerate dirty surroundings and will attempt to clean any surface it encounters, using its tail as a broom. There is something calming in that image, a small creature moving through the world tidying things as it goes, not because anyone asked it to, but because the presence of disorder is something it simply cannot ignore. Cinccino, Minccino's evolution, carries a coat described as silky to a degree that inspired fascination among researchers within its world. The oils secreted by its coat protect the fur against static electricity, against anything that would disturb the smoothness it maintains. Cinccino is a creature of surface, of texture, of the particular pleasure of a thing that is soft and smooth and undisturbed. Gothita, Golett, and Gothorita form a family whose design draws from fashion culture in a way unusual for Pokemon. The Gothita line takes its visual language from Gothic Lolita fashion, a Japanese style that blends elements of Victorian dress with dark aesthetics in a way that is highly formalized and recognizable to those who know it. The ribbons, the proportions, the particular quality of Gothitel's silhouette all point toward that tradition, which was at its cultural peak in Japan around the time Generation 5 was being developed. Solosis arrives as a single-celled looking creature, translucent and floating, surrounded by a membrane that is described as protecting it from any environment. Reuniclus, its final form, is described as having a brain so powerful that it can generate waves of psychic energy simply by clenching its hands together. The evolutionary arc from a single protected cell to a creature of immense mental power traces a line from biological beginning to intellectual peak. Ducklet is a water and flying type Pokemon, described as diving into water to feed on aquatic vegetation. Its Pokedex entry notes that even when hit, it refuses to flinch, which is interesting given that flinching is a mechanical phenomenon in the games that Ducklet is not immune to in any formal sense. The entry describes a personality trait rather than a mechanical property, the difference between what a creature will do and what a creature can be compelled to do. Swanna, Ducklet's evolution, dances. Its species designation is the white-bird Pokémon, and its Pokedex entries describe a creature whose movement through water takes the form of rhythmic coordinated motion that resembles a performance. In the mornings, groups of Swana gather on lakes and dance together before the sun has fully risen. There is something about that image, a gathering of white birds moving in coordinated grace in the early morning light, that feels entirely separate from the context of battles and competitive statistics. Vanillite began a line of Pokémon whose designs generated significant commentary from players who felt that ice cream cones were too simple, too directly derived from a human-made object, too literal in a way that crossed some boundary. What was less discussed was the internal logic of the design, which is rooted in ice that formed naturally around a specific core, shaped by wind and cold and temperature over time, rather than by any manufacturing process. The ice cream appearance is not the origin of the design, but the result of a natural process, which does not entirely resolve the debate, but does complicate it. Emolga carries a design that places it in a particular visual tradition of small electric-type Pokémon associated with something small and airborne. The comparison to Pikachu is obvious, but perhaps less interesting than the comparison to the flying squirrel that inspired it, a creature that does not truly fly, but glides on membranes stretched between limbs, covering ground in a way that looks like flight from a distance. Carablast and Shelmet are paired in an unusual evolution mechanic that requires them to be traded for each other simultaneously. When that trade occurs, both Pokémon evolve into different forms, each one gaining something from the other in the exchange. Escavalier takes the shell that belonged to Shelmet. Axelgor loses its shell and becomes faster because of the loss. The trade creates a dependency, a moment where two creatures cannot complete their growth alone. Fungus and Amoonguss arrived as Pokémon whose designs were widely read as references to Pokeballs, the spherical capture devices that define the mechanics of the series. The resemblance is deliberate and part of a particular kind of design that invites players to mistake a Pokémon for a familiar object. This mimicry strategy exists across other designs in the series, but Fungus commits to it with a completeness that makes the initial moment of recognition feel like a small joke being told by the game. Frillish and Jellicent form a line whose differences between genders are immediately visible. Male and female versions of these Pokémon have distinctly different colorations, different expressions, and different aesthetic moods. The male reads as quieter. The female reads as more imperious. Their Pokedex entries describe them as creatures that absorb the life energy of ships and their crews, draining sailors who become lost in fog. The combination of elegant physical design and quietly menacing behavior produces a particular flavor of unease. Alomomola appears at first glance to be connected evolutionarily to Luvedisc, the heart-shaped water type from Generation 3. The visual parallel is strong enough that players assumed a connection existed. No such connection was ever established. They are unrelated Pokémon who happen to share a shape. The apparent relationship, which was assumed by so many players, is simply not there. Joltik is the smallest Pokémon in Generation 5, and one of the smallest in the entire series. It clings to larger creatures to drain static electricity, which its body cannot produce on its own. A tiny creature that depends entirely on the proximity of others for its fundamental energy source is a quiet kind of design, a creature whose survival is inherently collaborative. Galvantula, Joltik's evolution, uses electrically charged webs in battle. Its Pokedex entries note that the webs it spins are capable of conducting electricity, and that any creature caught in them receives a jolt, alongside the physical constraint. The combination of a trap that also harms is an efficient and somewhat uncomfortable design choice for a spider-based Pokémon. Ferroseed and Ferrothorn form a grass and steel type line, a combination that was unique to them at the time of its introduction. The physical design connects iron spikes with a plant body in a way that reads as both natural and mechanical, a seed that has incorporated metal into its structure as it grew. Ferrothorn's battle reputation within the competitive community became substantial, its combination of typing and ability creating a defensive configuration that required specific strategies to address. Clink, Clang, and Clinkling arrived as a line of pure steel-type Pokémon whose designs were built entirely from the visual vocabulary of gears. 3 stages, each one adding more gears, each one suggesting greater mechanical complexity. The trio generated conversations similar to those around Vanillite, players questioning whether gears were an appropriate basis for creature design, while others noted that the history of Pokémon includes springs, magnets, and keys among its forms. Tynamo, Electric, and Eelektross form a line whose final evolution is one of the most defensively unusual in the series. Eelektross's typing is pure electric, and its ability is Levitate, which grants immunity to ground-type moves. In the type chart, no single type deals super effective damage to electric, combined with Levitate's ground immunity. Eelektross has no conventional type-based weakness. The only ways to damage it at increased effectiveness involve specific abilities or weather conditions rather than type interactions. Elgium and Behaeum carry a design language that draws on the iconography of alien contact and classic science fiction imagery. Elgium's name is a rendering of the letters L and M, standing for Little Man. The Pokedex describes Elgium as having appeared suddenly 50 years before the games take place, in a deserted mountain range. The implied origin and the design together construct a narrative of arrival from somewhere far away, rendered in the visual shorthand that the culture already had prepared for that idea. Litwick, Lampent, and Chandelure arrive as ghost and fire types, a combination that produces a family whose existence is described in consistently unsettling terms. Litwick leads souls to the spirit world. Lampent seeks dying people. Chandelure traps souls inside its flame and burns them, absorbing their essence, while the body that once held them wanders without purpose. The escalation from small and flickering to large and consuming follows a pattern of increasing darkness through the evolutionary line. Axew, Fracture, and Haxorus form a dragon-type line whose relationship with their tusks is central to their identity and their Pokedex documentation. When Axew's tusks break, they grow back stronger than before. Fracture takes care to polish its tusks after every battle, described as sharpening them against rocks and treating this maintenance as a serious obligation. Haxorus's tusks are described as hard enough to cut through steel while remaining unbreakable under any ordinary stress. The evolutionary arc of the line follows the tusks more closely than it follows anything else. Cubchoo and Beardick form a line whose design leans into an aspect of bears that tends not to appear in cute creature design. Cubchoo is almost entirely defined by the mucus hanging from its nose. According to its Pokedex entries, the mucus is a source of its power, and when it is healthy, the mucus flows freely. When it is sick, the mucus loses its elasticity and becomes less effective in battle. The creature's health is measured by the quality of its snot. Cryogonal is a snowflake-based Pokémon without any evolutionary relatives, a standalone creature whose design is built around the geometry of ice crystals. It captures prey using chains of ice crystals that form from its body, then freezes them. Its Pokedex entry notes that it was born from snow clouds, a statement that describes an origin rather than a parent, a creature that precipitated from weather. Shelmet and Carablast have been discussed, but Shelmet's evolution Axelgor deserves its own moment. Having lost the shell that slowed it, Axelgor becomes described as one of the faster creatures in the world. The evolutionary cost that one creature paid produced the transformation in the other, and both creatures emerged from the trade, altered in ways that defined them. Axelgor's speed is the direct result of Shelmet's loss. The two evolutions are connected by a moment of exchange that shaped what each of them became. Stunfisk is a ground and electric type, with a flat body that allows it to bury itself in mud. Its Pokedex entries note that it can endure being stepped on without apparent injury, and that it delivers an electric shock to anyone who does step on it. The two facts together describe a creature whose relationships with human feet is adversarial in a very specific way. Mianfu and Mianshao form a line rooted in the visual tradition of Chinese martial arts, particularly the flowing movements associated with wushu. Mianshao's whip-like arm fur is described in its Pokedex as being used as a weapon with a striking speed so fast it cannot be seen. The design places its primary attack capability not in its limbs, but in the fabric-like extensions of its fur, a solution that feels both elegant and unexpected. Drotagun is a dragon type without a secondary typing, one of the few fully evolved dragon-type Pokémon that carries no additional type. Its design features a bright red face and blue body, a contrast that makes it visually distinctive in a way that sets it apart from the more conventionally colored dragons. Its Pokedex notes that it uses the heat of the sun to warm its body, becoming unable to move if it gets cold. A dragon that depends on sunlight is a particular kind of creature, one whose power is conditional on warmth. Golett and Golurk form a ground and ghost type line whose design draws from the tradition of the golem, an animated being created from earth and stone and brought to life through magical means. Golurk's Pokedex entries describe a creature built by an ancient civilization to serve as a protector, sealed long ago and now carrying the energy of that original purpose within a body that has outlasted everything else from that time. The detail that a seal exists on its chest, and that removing the seal causes it to run rampant, gives Golurk a quality of contained power, something vast being held carefully in check. Pawniard and Bisharp form a dark and steel type evolutionary line. Bisharp leads groups of Pawniard, directing them in coordinated hunts. Its Pokedex descriptions place it in a position of command, a creature around whom others organize themselves. The relationship between Bisharp and its Pawniard is explicitly hierarchical in a way that most Pokemon lore does not address so directly. Bouffalant arrived as Unova's regional buffalo Pokemon, a large normal type whose defining physical feature is an enormous afro. Its Pokedex entries describe it headbutting train cars and derailing them. Bouffalant's lore suggests that even the presence of a running train is not something that gives it pause. The scale of what it will charge at is simply very large. Rooflicken and Braviary form a line described as an embodiment of American spirit and imagery. Braviary has been explicitly compared to a patriotic symbol, and its Japanese name leans into that association directly. The eagle imagery, the red, white, and blue coloration, the fighting spirit described in its Pokedex, all of these point toward a deliberate character construction around the idea of national pride. Braviary battles, according to its entries, even when badly injured, and it carries fallen comrades to safety before returning to fight again. Vullaby and Mandibuzz form the version-exclusive counterpart to that line. Where Braviary is associated with pride and martial valor, Mandibuzz is described as a patient scavenger. Mandibuzz nests in bones it has collected from the ground, decorating its body with the remnants of other creatures. Its design is one of the more aesthetically unusual in the series, a vulture Pokémon who builds its identity around the materials of endings. Heatmore and Durant exist in an ecological relationship described directly by their Pokedex entries. Heatmore is an anteater that feeds specifically on Durant. Durant is an ant that organizes its defenses specifically against Heatmore. The two creatures are defined in opposition to each other. Version exclusivity in the games means that in any given playthrough, a player encounters one and not the other. The relationship is described but rarely directly experienced. Durant's steel coating is described as incredibly hard, and its coordination with the other Durant in its colony is described as essentially perfect. Durant work in groups of extremely high precision. The efficiency of the collective is their primary defense, supplemented by the hardness of their bodies. Against Heatmore, the efficiency and the hardness are both still ultimately insufficient. Dino, Zwilus, and Hydreigon form a dragon and dark type family, whose names count in German. Dino for 1, Zwilus for 2, Hydreigon for 3, from the Greek root, with the German counting replacing the first syllable. The three-headed design of Hydreigon is embedded in the name's etymology. Each head represents a count, and the creature arrived at its final number. Laresta and Volcarona form a bug and fire type line that draws from both the imagery of larvae and the mythology of creatures associated with the sun. Volcarona's Pokedex entries describe it as a creature born from ancient fires that filled the world with light when volcanic ash darkened the skies. The language of the myth embedded in its documentation places Volcarona in the position of a solar substitute, a creature of warmth that stepped in when the actual sun could not be seen. Cobalion, Terrakion, and Veritian form the Swords of Justice, a trio designed explicitly around the Three Musketeers and the themes associated with that story. The visual connection to French literary tradition connects them, as mentioned earlier, to the French-influenced design of the Snivy line. That the Swords of Justice and the grass-type starters both draw from French cultural imagery in the same generation, and that the next generation was set in France, suggests a consistent thematic direction that was already organizing itself in Generation 5. Tornadus, Ithundurus, and Landorus form the forces of nature, three legendaries connected to weather and atmospheric phenomena. Their original incarnate forms carry a design that places them above clouds, humanoid torsos extending from swirling masses of elemental energy. Their Therian forms, introduced in a later game, replace that humanoid quality with animal bodies that feel more grounded and more natural. The two sets of forms describe the same creatures at different distances from human-adjacent appearance. Reshiram and Zekrom anchor the central legendary pair of Generation 5, a duality built not around light and shadow or fire and water, but around truth and in ideals. Reshiram represents truth. Zekrom represents ideals. The philosophical framing of their opposition is unusual in the series, which tends toward more elemental or cosmological dualities. The choice to ground the legendary conflict of black and white in epistemological and ethical categories gives the games a tonal ambition that distinguished them within the series. Kyurem, the third member of the trio, represents what remains when truth and ideals have separated. It is described as an empty vessel, a creature from which something vital has been removed, cold and hollow and vast. In the sequels, Kyurem confuse with either of the other legendary dragons, borrowing back the truth or the ideals it once held, taking on a form that integrates what was lost. The mechanic of fusion, as a form of recovering a lost wholeness, is a narrative idea that the gameplay implements directly. Keldeo arrived as the fourth member of the Swords of Justice, the young and unproven member of a group built around experience and courage. Its resolute form, which it achieves when it learns its signature move, Secret Sword, changes its appearance in a way that suggests readiness rather than merely growth. Keldeo becomes something when it has learned the thing that defines the others, a Pokemon whose completed form is a consequence of knowledge acquired, rather than a consequence of leveling or a stone. Meloetta carries two forms that express two different aspects of a single creature. Its aria form emphasizes music and voice. Its pirouette form emphasizes movement and physical expression. The transition between the two occurs through the use of Relic Song, its signature move, a piece of music so ancient that its melody is said to have the power to alter mood and memory. A Pokemon that changes its fundamental mode of being through the act of singing is one of the more elegant conceptual designs in this generation. Genesect is a fossil Pokemon in a sense different from the revived ancient creatures of most generations. Genesect was an actual Pokemon from prehistoric times that was recovered and then modified by Team Plasma, fitted with a cannon that was not part of its original design. The creature that exists in the games is not quite the creature that originally existed. It has been augmented. What players encounter is the result of a decision made by people who found something old and decided to change it. Minccino arrived as a small, normal-type creature whose relationship with cleanliness is not merely a preference, but something closer to a defining biological drive. Its Pokedex entries across multiple games describe the same behavior with the same insistence. Minccino finds dirty things and cleans them. It uses its tail as a broom, sweeping surfaces with the fur it keeps carefully groomed. When two Minccino meet, they groom each other with equal attention. The image of two small creatures carefully tending to each other in a quiet corner of the world is one of the gentler things the Pokedex has offered across the series. Cinccino extends that cleaning impulse into something more biological. The oils secreted naturally by Cinccino's coat are described as having properties that protect the fur from static buildup and from the kinds of friction that would disturb its texture. The coat also deflects attacks in ways that the oils facilitate, turning a grooming property into a defensive one. Cinccino's elegance is functional. The softness is not decorative. Gothita arrived as the first stage of a family whose design draws from a specific Japanese fashion tradition that was at its cultural peak around the time Generation 5 was being developed. Gothic Lolita fashion, which blends Victorian aesthetic elements with a darker visual palette, is the source for the ribbons, the particular quality of the silhouette, the layered visual identity that runs through Gothorita and Gothitelle. The style is formally codified, with specific rules about proportion and ornamentation that practitioners follow with care. Gothita's design respects those rules, and the escalation through the line toward Gothitelle's tall, composed, still presence follows an arc that the fashion tradition itself describes as a movement toward poise. Gothorita is described in its Pokedex entries as a creature that gazes at the night sky to memorize the position of stars, and that uses the power of those observed positions to control dreams. The connection between stargazing and dream manipulation gives Gothorita a particular quality of patient practice, a creature that acquires its power through sustained attention to something vast and distant. Gothitelle, the final form, is described as being able to distort space around itself to simulate a view of the starry sky as it appeared thousands of years ago, before any of the light that viewers currently see had traveled to reach their eyes. The stars Gothitelle shows are old. The creature holds something of the past. Solosis presents itself as a single-cell organism rendered visible and given a face, a tiny floating sphere of green surrounded by a membrane described in its Pokedex as capable of protecting it from any environment. Its Pokedex entries note that it communicates through telepathy because it lacks any other means, the membrane that protects it also isolating it from any kind of direct contact with the world outside. Duosion, the middle stage, has divided its brain in a way that can cause it to try to take two different actions simultaneously when its split minds disagree, a small portrait of inner conflict rendered in a floating blob of green. Reuniclus, the final form, moves its arms by will rather than by muscle, generating psychic power sufficient to shake the surrounding area when it clenches its hands. The evolutionary line traces a journey from protective isolation to integrated psychic power expressed through coordination. Ducklet arrived as a water and flying type, with a calm, round design and a Pokedex description of a creature that dives into water to pull up aquatic vegetation. Its entry in one game notes that even when hit, Ducklet refuses to flinch, preferring instead to launch a water attack in response. That description of behavior, rather than mechanical immunity, is a reminder that Pokedex entries and game mechanics describe the same creatures through different lenses. The entry tells a story about personality. The game describes a system. Neither is the complete picture. Swana's most memorable Pokedex entry describes what it does at dawn. Groups of Swana gather on lakes in the early morning and dance together before the day has properly begun. The word dance appears in multiple entries for this line, and the coordination implied by group dancing, Swana moving together in patterns before an audience of no one but each other, gives the species a quality of shared ritual that feels almost ceremonial. Swana's species designation is the white bird Pokémon, and there is something fitting about a white bird that performs a morning ceremony before the light has fully arrived. Vanillite began a discussion that the Pokémon community has returned to across multiple generations about what constitutes an appropriate basis for creature design. Vanillite is based on soft-serve ice cream. The visual resemblance is complete. Players who encountered it for the first time often reacted with skepticism, wondering whether a game about collecting creatures was appropriate territory for soft-serve cone designs. The counter-argument, which exists within the design's own documentation, is that Vanillite is not a made ice cream. It is a natural formation. The creature's Pokedex entries describe ice that formed around a core when a particularly cold puff of air breathed life into a snowflake. Vanillite is ice that took a particular shape because of atmospheric conditions, not because anyone manufactured it. Whether that origin resolves the design debate is a matter of individual preference, but the distinction is present and was apparently considered. Vanillish, the middle stage, is found on cold mountains at high altitude, living in landscapes where its appearance provides effective camouflage. Vanillux, the final form, produces blizzards by simultaneously inhaling great quantities of water and producing an internal weather event. Two faces, two bodies partially merged, one creature capable of generating its own storms. Deerling and Sawsbuck form a line whose fundamental visual identity changes with the seasons. Their appearance shifts across 4 seasonal forms, each one carrying the color palette of a different part of the year. The game system in Generation 5 had an actual internal calendar that affected which seasonal form appeared in the wild, meaning that a player who encountered a deerling in the summer would see a different appearance than one who encountered it in winter. The Pokémon itself was connected to real time in a way that most Pokémon are not. Sawsbuck's seasonal forms are perhaps more dramatic, the antlers transforming through the year from bare wood to heavy green, to flowers to dry autumn leaves. Emolga is a normal and electric type, whose design is built around the flying squirrel, a creature that does not fly in any technical sense, but glides on membranes stretched between its limbs. Emolga hides in trees and launches itself from branches, covering ground in long, arcing glides while releasing electrical discharges. Its Pokedex entries describe the electricity as something it uses both for attacking and for charging itself during flight, a creature that harvests the energy of its own movement. Escavalier arrived from the exchange with Shelmet, wearing the shell it took during the trade. Its Pokedex entries describe it as a knight, moving slowly and deliberately, attacking with the lances formed by the spikes on its body. The slowness that comes from wearing the shell is described not as a weakness, but as a quality of measured advance. Escavalier does not hurry. It arrives eventually, armored completely, and the fact that it arrived after being exchanged for something else only adds to the quality of its identity. Fungus and Amoonguss are Pokémon that have been read almost universally as visual references to Pokeballs, and the reading is supported by the design. The red and white circular pattern that covers both creatures is identical in composition to the spheres used to capture them. Players who walk through grass and find a Pokeball on the ground discover, on closer examination, that some of those objects are creatures waiting to be encountered. The design rewards attention and then surprises those who thought they already knew what they were looking at. Frillish exists in two genders that look different enough to carry different aesthetic and narrative implications. Male Frillish is blue and carries a more restrained expression. Female Frillish is pink and carries a quality that its Pokedex describes as deceptive sweetness. Its entries note that female Frillish lures sailors with its pleasant appearance and then pulls them to depths from which they cannot return. The design asks players to hold two things simultaneously: the visual of a gentle floating creature and the behavioral description of something predatory beneath the gentleness. Jellicent, the fully evolved form, is a ghost-type creature whose body is made of seawater. It absorbs the ships it sinks and the crews of those ships into its body. Its Pokedex entries in multiple games note that those who vanish in the stretch of ocean where Jellicent lives are never seen again. The ship graveyard that these entries describe is a place defined entirely by accumulated absence. Jellicent presides over it. Alomomola appears to be a relative of Lovedisk. Both are heart-shaped water Pokémon. Both share visual similarities significant enough that players across many years assumed a connection. There is no evolutionary relationship between them. They are separate Pokémon with a shared visual vocabulary and no biological link. The assumption of connection was widespread enough to become a common topic in discussions about the series, and its absence is one of the more notable design decisions that was never made. Joltik is small, and its Pokedex entries make the most of that smallness. It cannot generate its own electricity and instead feeds on the static discharge produced by larger electric-type Pokémon. It attaches to them when they are not looking, draining a small amount of charge, then releases before being noticed. The behavior is presented without particular judgment. Joltik needs electricity. Larger creatures produce surplus electricity. The arrangement satisfies a need without significant cost to either party, though the larger Pokémon are apparently unaware of it. Galvantula spins electrically charged webs that deliver both mechanical and electrical harm to anything caught in them. Its Pokedex notes that it can also deploy those webs as part of coordinated hunting behavior, using them to guide or restrict prey. The combination of physical entrapment and electrical stimulation in a single material is a design detail that has a real biological parallel in the electrosensitive hairs found in some actual spiders, though Galvantula takes that idea considerably further than nature currently has. Ferroseed carries iron spikes that it uses to cling to cave walls. When startled, it fires those spikes outward in all directions, then rolls itself away while the spikes create a barrier. The evolutionary relationship between Ferroseed and Ferrothorn is one of the more dramatic physical transformations in the generation, a small spiked ball becoming a large armored creature capable of swinging iron-tipped chains. The chain attacks described in Ferrothorn's Pokedex entries are precise and powerful, suggesting a creature that has converted the defensive spikes of its earlier form into offensive tools. Clink appeared in Unova with no prior evolutionary relatives and no clearly established origin narrative. Its Pokedex describes two gears that found each other when they were young and decided to stay together, fitting their rotations into a shared rhythm that became their form of life. Clang and Clinklang add more gears to that original pair, but the story that the line tells is ultimately about two things that found their complementary counterpart and built an existence around that fit. The design is mechanical, the story is relational. Dynamo exists as one of the few Pokémon with a total move pool of exactly 4 moves. It is also a pure electric type, a designation it shares with its evolution, electric, and a line that culminates in Electros, which has been described. The smallness of Dynamo's move pool means that players who use it are constrained to a very particular expression of its capabilities, a creature that does one kind of thing and only that kind of thing until it becomes something larger. LGM's Pokedex entries describe a creature that arrived in the mountains of Unova 50 years before the events of the games, having appeared suddenly without any record of where it came from. Scientists studying its brain have found that it can transmit images directly into the minds of those nearby, allowing it to show others what it is thinking without language. The implication that LGM communicates through shared visualization, showing interior images to willing or unwilling recipients, gives it a relationship to private experience that is more intimate and potentially less comfortable than most forms of communication. Behayam, its evolution, is described as having memorized the locations of every person in any given town. It can manipulate memories, rewriting or erasing them. Players who encounter Behayam in the wild are meeting a creature that may already know where they have been. Its Pokedex entries suggest a creature whose intelligence is exercised primarily through observation and modification of others, a quiet and thorough watcher. Litwick's relationship with the souls it encounters is documented with consistency across its Pokedex entries. The small candle flame Pokémon leads lost people through the dark, and the light it offers is real. The problem is that while it leads, it feeds. The life energy of those who follow its light is absorbed gradually, without their knowledge, until they have been drained. The service and the harm are simultaneous and inseparable. Litwick is not malicious, according to the entries. It is simply what it is. Lampent waits in cities and hospitals for people whose lives are ending. When it senses that death is approaching, it appears near that person and waits. What it does with the soul it takes is described as fueling its own flame. The image of a lamp Pokémon haunting hospital corridors in anticipation is one of the darker things that the series has committed to paper in a Pokedex entry, and it appears without softening or reframing. Chandelure burns those souls to light itself. The body of anyone whose soul Chandelure consumes wanders the world afterward, described as moving without purpose, without the thing that animated it, an empty physical form continuing through the motions of existence after the essential part has been taken. This evolutionary line escalates from a flickering, helpful darkness dweller to a chandelier that leaves empty bodies walking behind it. The escalation is one of the more carefully designed arcs of any evolutionary family in the generation. Axu's relationship with its tusks begins early. When they break, which apparently happens often, they grow back stronger. The Pokedex entries describe this regeneration as a source of the Pokemon's toughness, each regrowth producing something harder than what was lost. The evolutionary logic is one of accumulation through damage, a creature strengthened by the injuries it sustains and survives. Fracture takes the care of its tusks seriously enough that it polishes them after every battle, described as using rocks to sharpen and smooth them before resting. The attention paid to maintenance, the consistent ritual of upkeep that Fracture apparently engages in unprompted, gives it a quality of discipline that feels almost contemplative. A creature that fights and then spends quiet time caring for the tools of its next fight is a creature with a particular relationship to preparation. Haxorus completes the line as one of the more physically powerful dragon types in its generation, with tusks described as capable of cutting through steel without suffering damage. Its Pokedex notes that despite this power, Haxorus is calm in ordinary circumstances and only shows its full capabilities when provoked. The combination of enormous physical strength held in reserve behind ordinary behavior is a design pattern that appears across several dragon types, the idea of a creature capable of tremendous destruction that generally chooses not to exercise that capability. Cubchoo's design committed to something that most Pokemon designs avoid. Its defining feature is a large drop of mucus hanging from its nose. The Pokedex entries explain this as a functional element rather than a cosmetic one. The quality of the mucus indicates the health of the Pokemon, and the mucus itself is described as the source of its ice-type powers. When Cubchoo is sick, the quality of the mucus declines, and the creature's battle effectiveness declines with it. The bodily fluid is carrying both the health information and the energy simultaneously. Beartic is large and cold, and its Pokedex entries describe a creature whose breath freezes the surrounding air into ice. It creates footholds for itself in frozen seawater by breathing on the surface. Its claws are likewise described as powerful enough to break ice flows. Beartic's relationship with frozen water is entirely active, a creature that does not simply survive in cold environments, but shapes them through its own biological output. Cryogonal floats and spins and hunts with chains of ice crystals. It was born from a snow cloud, according to its entries, and when the temperature rises, it evaporates into water vapor and rejoins the sky. The life cycle implies a creature that alternates between solid and vapor states, materializing from weather and returning to it when conditions change. This gives Cryogonal a relationship with its environment that is more literally atmospheric than most water or ice types. Axelgor became what it is through loss. Having given up the shell that slowed it, it moves with a speed its Pokedex compares to ninja movement, wrapping itself in its own membranous body to reduce air resistance and striking with precise rapid attacks. The lightness that it gained is described as almost painful in the cold, the creature needing to stay active to prevent itself from drying out. The cost of the speed is constant movement, a creature that cannot rest as freely as those who chose to keep what protected them. Stunfisk is described in its entries as a particularly difficult to distinguish from the surrounding mud when it buries itself beneath the surface. It paralyzes anything that steps on it with an electric discharge. Its expression when it does so is described as smiling. Stunfisk faces its interactions with those who stumble into it with apparent satisfaction, a creature whose trapping behavior is accompanied by something that reads as contentment. Mienshau's whip attacks, delivered with the long fur on its arms, are described as moving faster than the eye can follow. Its Pokedex entries note that researchers have been unable to observe the attacks directly, only the aftermath. The speed of movement that exceeds visual tracking is attributed to a combination of physical training and the particular properties of the fur itself. Mienshao is a creature that has developed its natural material into a weapon through sustained refinement. Dredagon has claws described as able to grip rock without slipping, and a body that absorbs the heat of the sun so thoroughly that it cannot function in cold environments. Its wings are not for flying, but for capturing sunlight, spread wide to maximize absorption. A dragon that is solar powered and cold sensitive is a different kind of dragon, one whose power is conditional on warmth and whose limitations are real and specific. Golett carries within it an energy described as ancient. Its makers, an ancient civilization, remain unnamed and unelaborated in its entries. What the entries do establish is that Golett was built with a purpose that preceded any living memory, carrying a mission that may have been completed or abandoned long before anything in the current world could remember it. Golett moves through the present, carrying the weight of that assignment, purposeful in some direction that cannot be entirely known. Golurk was originally discovered lying dormant, too large to have arrived recently, too persistent to have been made recently. When the seal on its chest is removed, it loses control. The seal was placed there by the civilization that created it, and its purpose was presumably to keep the energy contained to whatever scale of action was originally intended. Without the seal, something larger and less directed is released. The seal is the restraint of purpose itself. Pawniard forms groups around individual Bisharp, each group acting as a unit in coordinated hunts. When a Bisharp loses to a Pawniard in battle, that Pawniard takes the lead position. The hierarchy is determined through combat in a way that both reinforces strength and allows for genuine change through demonstrated capability. The group is not merely followers and a leader, but a system that can reorganize itself based on outcome. Bisharp is described as hunting in forests alongside its Pawniard, directing them with precision. Its final form in later games, Kingambit, extends this to an even more elaborate social structure, but in Unova, Bisharp represents the apex of a hierarchy maintained through ongoing competition rather than fixed inheritance. Bouffalant carries the physical mass of a large bovine and the temperament of a creature that regards obstacles as things to be removed rather than avoided. Its Pokedex entries describe it headbutting train cars with enough force to derail them, and then walking away with no apparent injury. Its afro absorbs the impact of its own headbutts, allowing it to continue delivering force without accumulating the feedback. The afro is functional armor, a design choice that is simultaneously funny and internally coherent. Rooflet evolves into Braviary after sufficient growth, and Braviary carries in its design a deliberate assemblage of symbols associated with a particular kind of national identity. The red and white and blue of its plumage, the eagle association, the descriptions of combat without retreat, and comrades carried from the battlefield, all of these constitute a design that wears its thematic intention openly. Braviary is a statement, and the statement is about a particular kind of valor. Volibear wears a bone like a diaper, protecting itself with the remnants of something that is no longer using what it once had. Mandibuzz collects bones to decorate its body, building a nest from them for its young. The use of remains as both protection and decoration gives this evolutionary line a relationship with death that is practical rather than morbid, a creature that finds utility and care in what others have left behind. Heatmore's tongue burns at temperatures that allow it to melt through Durant's steel coating. The Pokedex describes them as locked in an ancient predator-prey relationship so specific that Durant's entire defensive evolution can be understood partly as a response to Heatmore's particular method of attack. Two species whose evolutionary pressures have been shaped primarily by each other is a biological concept called coevolution, and the game presents it directly in the documentation of these two creatures. Durant works in groups whose coordination is described as virtually perfect. When Heatmore approaches, they swarm it, attempting to drive it away through collective action. The individual Durant is small. The collective Durant is something larger and more effective. Their colony intelligence is their primary defense, and it is described as sufficient most of the time, which means it is not sufficient all of the time. Dano's name means one in German. Svilos means two. Hydreigon's name begins with Hydra, from the Greek for many-headed water serpent, but the counting scheme within the name points toward 3. The line counts its own heads in the names of its stages, and by the time Hydreigon is reached, the creature has more heads than it had at its previous stage, completing the sequence. Hydreigon's additional heads, described as growing from its arms, are said to act independently, all 3 biting in different directions simultaneously. The entry notes that none of the 3 heads possess a brain. All thinking is done elsewhere. Larvesta is massive for a larva, described as large enough to intimidate even fully evolved Pokémon. Its body releases fire from the 5 horns on its head when it is ready to evolve. Volcarona's Pokedex entries describe an ancient fire that it carried when ash clouds blocked the sunlight during some prehistoric event, filling the sky with light in place of the sun that could not be seen. Whether the story is myth or fact within the world of the games is left unclear, but the scale of the claim that a bug replaced the sun for a period of time is one of the grander things the Pokedex has asserted in describing the ecological role of a Pokémon. Cobalion, the first of the Swords of Justice, is a steel and fighting type, described as having a gaze so intense that it can paralyze any Pokémon that meets its eyes. Its Pokedex entries describe it as having protected Pokémon from humans during ancient conflicts, taking on both the role of defender and of judge. It regards both Pokémon and humans with the same sharp assessment, looking for whether their strength and character justify their presence. Terrakion carries the memory of those ancient conflicts in its Pokedex entries with more explicit description than the others. Its entries describe it as having destroyed a castle during a time when humans persecuted Pokémon, demolishing the structure with a charge powerful enough to bring down massive stone walls. The scale of the damage described gives Terrakion a history of action that the other members of the trio do not carry as directly. It does not merely remember the conflict, it changed the landscape of it. Virition's speed in battle is compared to Whirlwind by its Pokedex entries, and its graceful movement is described as confusing opponents who cannot track what they are seeing. The grass and fighting type combination reflects the dual nature of its identity, a creature that moves like something natural and strikes like something trained. Its connection to the literary tradition of the Musketeers places it alongside Cobalion and Terrakion in a trio built around the idea of loyalty and coordinated purpose. Tornadus carries a cloud and releases destructive winds. Its Therian form, introduced in a later pair of games, transforms it from a humanoid tornado rider into a bird, and the change of form represents something fundamental about how the same creature can be understood in different ways. The incarnate form emphasizes the elemental force. The Therian form emphasizes the living creature within it. Thundurus similarly transforms, moving from a lightning-summoning humanoid to a dragon-like beast. Its Pokedex entries in its original form describe it as traveling across Unova, dropping thunderbolts so densely that the landscape is permanently altered by its passing. Fields scorched, trees splintered, Thundurus's presence is legible in the changed landscape it leaves behind. Landorus arrives as the mediator of the group, the one described as bringing fertile soil in the wake of the destruction that Tornadus and Thundurus leave. The dynamic the trio embodies is elemental, destructive force followed by renewal. Landorus is the renewal, carrying within its legend the idea that damage and growth are not opposites, but stages of the same cycle. Reshiram's dragon and fire type combination supports its role as the Pokemon of truth. Its tail is described as a fusion reactor, generating enough heat to distort the air around it. When it burns with purpose, the flames carry a quality described in its entries as capable of changing the future. The scale of that claim is enormous, and the game offers it with the same composure it uses for every other Pokedex entry. Zekrom generates electricity from a generator in its tail that creates antimatter, according to its Pokedex. The energy released charges the air around it and can cause massive storms. Where Reshiram's fire is connected to truth and clarity, Zekrom's electricity is connected to ideals and commitment. The philosophical duality is expressed through the physics of what each creature does with its power. Truth burns visibly. Ideals charge the air invisibly and build to storms. Kyurem is what remains when the two parts of a formerly unified being separated. Its body is described as incomplete, hollow in places where something should be, colder than anything should be. In temperatures reaching below -100 degrees Celsius, Kyurem generates ice that spreads outward from its body. The cold it produces is the cold of absence, of something missing from the inside. Keldeo's journey toward its resolute form is structured as a coming of age in the language the series uses for growth. Learning Secret Sword, the move that defines the Swords of Justice as a group, transforms Keldeo visually and narratively. The form change is not a level up, it is a recognition. The creature became what it was becoming through the act of learning something that mattered. Meloetta's two forms express two modes of being that coexist within a single creature without contradiction. The Aria form is still and composed, organized around voice. The pirouette form is kinetic and physical, organized around movement. The transition between them occurs through music so old that its words have been forgotten, leaving only melody. A creature whose forms are accessed through an ancient song whose lyrics no one remembers anymore is a particular kind of design, carrying the weight of something that used to be known and no longer is. Genesect is the only Pokemon known to have been modified by human hands from its original design. Everything about its canon, the driver that sits atop its body and changes the type of its signature move, is described as an addition. The original Genesect, the creature that lived 300 million years before the games take place, did not have those things. Team Plasma found something ancient and improved upon it by their own estimation, and what players encounter in the game carries both the antiquity of its origin and the technology of its modification simultaneously. Minccino arrived as a small, normal-type creature with a dedication to cleanliness that its Pokedex entries return to across multiple games with the kind of consistency that suggests it is not a personality quirk, but a biological imperative. Minccino cannot leave a dirty surface unattended. If it encounters smudges or dust, it begins sweeping immediately using its tail, which it keeps in meticulous condition for exactly this purpose. When two Minccino meet, they do not simply greet each other. They groom each other, moving through the fur on each other's tails with careful attention until both are satisfied. The social behavior of grooming is common in many real animals and tends to indicate trust and affiliation. In Minccino's case, it also serves a practical function, because the cleaner the tail, the more effective the sweeping. The social and the functional are, for Minccino, the same act. Cinccino, the evolution of Minccino, extends that cleanliness into something with defensive applications. The natural oils secreted by Cinccino's coat give its fur properties that go beyond aesthetics. The oils prevent static buildup and allow attacks to glance off the coat rather than landing fully. What began as a grooming behavior in Minccino becomes a genuine protective feature in Cinccino. The evolution of the line traces a path from compulsion to capability, from a creature that cleans because it must to a creature that benefits physically from having always done so. Gothita arrived as the beginning of one of the more cohesive design families in Generation 5. The Gothita line draws its aesthetic from Gothic Lolita fashion, a Japanese style that fuses Victorian-era silhouettes and ornamentation with darker visual elements and precise rules about proportion. Gothic Lolita is a formalized style in a way that distinguishes it from more casual borrowings of Victorian imagery. Practitioners follow specific conventions about lace placement, the relationship between hem length and heel height, the weight and texture of fabric. Gothita's ribbons and its proportions carry those conventions into a Pokémon design with enough fidelity that anyone familiar with the fashion tradition recognizes it immediately. Gothita extends the aesthetic of the line towards something more elaborate and more connected to the night sky. Its Pokedex entries describe a creature that stands and stares at stars for hours, memorizing their positions with such precision that it can use the coordinates it has accumulated to control the dreams of sleeping people. The image of a small Pokémon standing alone in an open field at night, face turned upward, still and focused, holding a map of the sky inside itself, is one of the quieter and more evocative images the Pokedex produces in Generation 5. The connection between stargazing and dream manipulation is not explained mechanically. It simply exists as a fact about what Gothita does. Gothitelle, the final form of the line, pushes the astronomical dimension further. Its Pokedex entries describe it as capable of distorting the space around its body to create a visual representation of the night sky as it appeared thousands of years ago. The light from stars takes time to travel. The stars we see in the present sky are not those stars as they are now, but as they were when their light began its journey. Gothitelle shows an even older sky, one that the present world has moved past. The ability to display a historic skas is a particular kind of melancholy built into a Pokemon's design, a creature whose most remarkable quality is the ability to show you something that no longer exists. Solosis presents as a single living cell floating inside a membrane described as capable of surviving any environment. This makes Solosis something of an extreme organism by the standards of the series, a creature so protected by its outer layer that no external condition can threaten it. It communicates by telepathy because the membrane prevents direct contact with anything outside itself. Protection and isolation come from the same structure. Solosis is safe, and Solosis is sealed. Duosion's internal situation is complicated in a way that its Pokedex describes with unusual candor. Its brain has divided into two, and when those two halves want different things simultaneously, Duosion tries to execute both actions at once. The result is behavior that looks confused from the outside and probably feels confused from the inside. The middle stage of this evolutionary line is a creature in genuine internal disagreement, a state that the design renders visible through the doubled brain structure. Reuniclus resolves the tension of Duosion into something integrated and powerful. Three brains working in coordination produce psychic energy of unusual strength. When Reuniclus clenches its hands, the coordinated output of those three brains generates waves capable of disturbing the surrounding area. The evolutionary journey from one sealed cell to three coordinated minds is one of the more unusual arcs in the generation, moving from isolation through conflict into a kind of plural harmony. Ducklet arrived as a water and flying type Pokemon whose Pokedex entries describe it diving beneath the surface of lakes to pull up aquatic vegetation. This feeding behavior grounded Ducklet in something naturalistic at a time when some of the designs around it were considerably more abstract. What makes Ducklet's entry in Pokemon Black worth noting is the assertion that Ducklet will not flinch even when hit. In the game system, flinching is a status effect applied by certain moves. Ducklet is not immune to flinching by any mechanical means. The entry describes a personality rather than a rule, the distinction between what a creature chooses to do and what external forces can make it do, a philosophical gap embedded in a small aquatic bird's documentation. Swanna carries its most memorable quality, not in its battle capabilities, but in its behavior at dawn. Swanna gather on open water in the early hours and perform a coordinated dance before the day has established itself. The entry does not explain the purpose of the dancing. It does not suggest the dance is for attracting mates or establishing territory or warming up muscles in the cold morning air. It simply describes the dance as something that happens, a gathering of white birds moving together in the early light for reasons that are sufficient unto themselves. That kind of lore, describing behavior without explaining it, gives a Swanna a quality of mystery that a more functional description would not produce. Vanillite provoked a conversation about what counts as an appropriate source for Pokemon design that the community has returned to more than once. Ice cream cones, many argued, were objects rather than creatures, human inventions rather than natural phenomena, and building a Pokemon around one crossed some threshold they had not consciously defined but recognized when they saw it crossed. The counterargument exists inside Vanillite's own Pokedex entries, which describe a creature that formed when a particularly cold puff of air brought a naturally occurring accumulation of snow and ice to life. Vanillite is not manufactured soft serve. It is ice given form by temperature and breath, shaped by the specific conditions of a cold place, rather than by any hand. The conversation about where the boundary lies between object and creature, between inspiration and copying, did not resolve, and Vanillite has remained in an interesting position in that ongoing discussion ever since. Vanillish lives at high altitude, where the snow is persistent and the temperatures allow its icy body to remain stable. It camouflages itself among natural ice formations, moving slowly enough that it becomes difficult to distinguish from the snow around it. The camouflage is passive, a consequence of resemblance, rather than of deliberate behavior. Vanillish simply looks like its environment, and so it blends into it. Vanillix carries two faces, both with their own expressions, and produces blizzards by taking in large quantities of water and processing it internally. The blizzard generation is described as a coordinated effort between the two parts of its body. When both heads sneeze simultaneously, the resulting storm is particularly powerful. The description of sneezing as a primary attack mechanism for a legendary caliber weather event is one of the more peculiar combinations of the mundane and the dramatic that the Pokedex achieves in this generation. Deerling's 4 seasonal forms represent one of the more direct connections the Generation 5 games made between Pokemon and real-world time. The internal calendar of Pokemon Black and White tracked the actual seasons, and while Deerling appeared in whichever seasonal form matched the current real-world month, a player encountering Deerling in December would see the winter form. A player encountering it in June would see the summer form. The Pokemon existed in a different relationship with time than most other wild encounters, its appearance determined not by where you walked, but by when you played. Sawsbuck extends this across its antlers in particular, which move through the seasons from bare winter branches to spring flowers, to dense summer green, to the dried leaves of autumn. The antlers tell the time of year, and the time of year changes what the creature is. Emolga carries an electric and normal type combination that places it in an unusual position within the series. Its design is based on the Japanese dwarf flying squirrel, a real animal notable for the membranes stretching between its limbs that allow it to glide between trees. Emolga does not fly in any technical sense, and neither does the animal it is based on, but both cover ground by launching from high places and spreading themselves wide, and both do so with a facility that looks like flight from a distance. Emolga's Pokedex entries describe it launching from tall trees and soaring over long distances, releasing electric discharges during its glides. The electrical release during movement is a design detail that suggests the gliding itself is generating or releasing energy, the motion and the electricity connected. Carablast and Shelmet are version-exclusive Pokémon that require each other to reach their final forms, and the mechanic through which that happens is a trade of one for the other. When the simultaneous trade occurs, both Pokémon transform. Carablast acquires the shell that Shelmet was wearing and evolves into Siscavalier, an armored insect knight. Shelmet loses its shell and evolves into Axelgor, a creature defined entirely by the speed its newfound lightness allows. The exchange is not merely mechanical. It is described in the Pokedex as something that happens because of the electrical stimulation of trading, triggering evolutionary responses in both creatures simultaneously. Two creatures that could not complete their growth alone achieve it through a moment of mutual exchange. Escavalier moves slowly. The shell it gained from Shelmet is heavy and restricting, and Escavalier's combat style is one of deliberate advance rather than rapid engagement. Its Pokedex entries describe it as a Pokémon that rushes its enemies with its lances extended, but rush in Escavalier's case appears to be a relative term. The jousting knight aesthetic of its design is more convincing than its speed stat, and yet Escavalier remains a credible battler because its defenses are formidable and its attack is high enough that arriving slowly is still arriving dangerously. Fungus carries a design built entirely on misdirection. Its red and white cap, visible from above as a player navigates tall grass, looks enough like a pokeball that players who have played the games long enough to move quickly through familiar terrain sometimes still stop when they notice one. The joke the design tells is a simple one, but told with perfect commitment. Fungus does not look like a creature that looks like a pokeball. Fungus looks like a pokeball. The resemblance is total, and that totality is the joke. Amoonguss extends the mimicry into a fully evolved form, larger and more elaborate, but still built around the same visual pun. Its Pokedex entries note that it waves its Pokeball patterned caps to lure prey. The luring behavior makes the mimicry active rather than passive, Amoonguss not simply resembling a Pokeball, but using that resemblance as a hunting strategy. The design has given a Pokemon not just a shape, but a reason for having that shape, and the reason is predatory. Frillish's design differences between male and female versions are significant enough to change the creature's emotional register entirely. Male Frillish is blue and quiet-looking, floating with an expression that suggests patience. Female Frillish is pink and wears what its Pokedex entries describe as a deceptively gentle expression, behind which it lures sailors to their deaths by drawing them toward it and then pulling them into depths they cannot escape from. The word deceptive appears in the design's documentation, making the difference between the male and female versions not merely aesthetic but behavioral and moral. Two genders of the same species, one patient and one predatory. Jellicent carries the predatory behavior of Frillish to a scale that the Pokedex entries describe with particular detail. It absorbs ships and their crews into its body. The ships disappear. The crews disappear. The stretch of ocean where Jellicent congregates is a place where things go and do not return, and Jellicent is the reason. Its Pokedex entries note that it needs the life energy of those it consumes to maintain its own existence. The consumption is biological necessity rather than cruelty, which does not particularly change the outcome for the sailors, but places Jellicent in the long tradition of Pokémon whose survival mechanisms are disturbing precisely because they are involuntary. A Lamamola has been mentioned for the assumption it creates and did not earn, but there is more to say about what it actually is. Its Pokedex entries describe a Pokemon that wraps wounded creatures in its fins and guides them to shore. The healing behavior is described as instinctive, a response to the presence of injury rather than a deliberate act of care. A Lamamola does not choose to heal. It heals because that is what it does when it encounters something hurt. The involuntary compassion of a creature whose biology drives it toward tending to wounds is a different kind of warmth than deliberate kindness, but it is warmth nonetheless. Joltik's method of obtaining electricity relies entirely on proximity to other electric-type Pokémon. Its own body cannot generate the charge it needs to survive. It finds Galvantula or other larger electric types and attaches to them, drawing small amounts of charge without the host noticing. The behavior is described in its Pokedex entries, not as parasitic in a way that implies harm, because the amounts drawn are small enough that the host experiences no detectable loss. Joltik takes what it needs from something that has more than enough, and the host continues as before. The arrangement is quietly sustainable in a way that makes Joltik's dependence feel less like vulnerability and more like an elegant solution. Galvantula's electric webs are one of the more mechanically interesting design details of the generation. The webs themselves conduct electricity, meaning that anything trapped in one is simultaneously restrained and being shocked. The defensive application of electrically charged silk deployed in advance of a confrontation makes Galvantula a creature whose strategy involves preparation rather than direct engagement. It sets the stage before the battle begins. Ferroseed grows in caves, pressing itself against rocky surfaces and drawing minerals from the stone into its body. The iron spikes it generates become progressively denser as it absorbs more mineral content, giving older Ferroseed a heavier and more formidable appearance than younger ones. The evolutionary history is visible in the creature's body in a way that rewards attention. Ferrothorn, its evolution, weaponizes the spikes that Ferroseed used for attachment, developing chains it uses in battle and a body sturdy enough to withstand significant force. The defensive creature becomes an offensive one without losing any of the defensive qualities that defined the earlier stage. Clink presents itself as two gears that found each other. Its Pokedex entries describe young Clink trying to mesh their rotations with other gears and failing the fit wrong, the rhythm incompatible, until they find the particular gear whose rotation complements their own. Two gears that mesh perfectly stay together and become a single entity. The search for the right fit and the decision to stay with it, once found, is the biographical arc of every Clink, encoded in the design and the documentation simultaneously. Clang adds more complexity to the gear arrangement, introducing a larger ring gear around the central pair. The mechanics of how the gears interact to generate and store electricity are described in general terms across Clang's entries, the specifics less important than the general picture of a creature whose body has become a more elaborate machine. Klinklong, the final form, rotates its gears at high speed to generate electricity, then stores that charge in a spiked ring that can release it rapidly. The storage and release dynamic makes Klinklang feel less like a creature and more like a device, which is almost certainly an intentional quality of the design. Tynamo exists in a state of mechanical simplicity unusual for a fully functional Pokémon. It can learn 4 moves in total. It is tiny and its individual capabilities are limited in almost every measurable way. But Tynamo is a pure electric type, the first stage of a line that culminates in something notable, and its simplicity in the early stages sets up the contrast with Electros in a way that makes the final form's distinctiveness more apparent. The journey from almost nothing to a Pokemon with no effective weakness is not always a straight line. Electric wraps around prey and delivers electrical charges that drain the energy from whatever it catches. Its Pokedex entries describe the predatory behavior in detail, the coiling and the charging and the feeding. Electros continues this into a form large enough to emerge from the ocean and pull bird Pokemon from the sky, a predator that operates across both aquatic and aerial space, its sucker mouth allowing it to maintain grip on whatever it catches. The lack of any type-based weakness in Electros is a mechanical fact, but the Pokedex entries suggest a creature whose physical design has also arrived at something difficult to attack from any direction. Elgyem arrived in the mountains of Unova approximately 50 years before the events of the games. No one knows where it came from before that. The mountains are given as a location of appearance, but not of origin, and the distinction matters. Elgyem appeared in the mountains. It did not come from the mountains. Where it came from remains undocumented. Its Pokedex entries describe the ability to transmit images directly into the minds of others and to compress the brains of enemies using psychic force, 2 capabilities that together suggest a creature with both communicative and destructive psychic applications. The combination is unusual. Most psychic Pokemon lean one direction or the other. Beheeyem carries the memory manipulation capabilities, described in its entries more extensively than most ghost or psychic type Pokemon. It can rewrite the memories of those it encounters, erasing or altering what they know about what has happened. Its Pokedex in one game states that it has memorized the locations of every individual in any town it visits, a surveillance behavior described without editorial comment. Beheeyem knows where everyone is. That knowledge is simply one of the things it does with its time. Litwick's Pokedex entries are direct about what it is and what it does. It offers light to those lost in dark places. That light is real and functions as guidance. At the same time, anyone who follows Litwick's light is gradually losing life energy to the creature, absorbed without their awareness. The helpful thing and the harmful thing are not in conflict. They are the same action, experienced differently depending on which side of the relationship you occupy. Litwick helps people find their way and feeds on them as it does so. Both of these things are true without one canceling the other. Lampent has refined the feeding behavior of Litwick into something more targeted. Rather than waiting for lost travelers, Lampent seeks out those who are dying. It positions itself near people whose life energy is at its lowest point and waits. The efficiency of this approach is cold and also makes a kind of biological sense. Lampent is not cruel. It has simply identified the most accessible source of what it needs and positioned itself accordingly. The fact that this means haunting hospitals and sick rooms does not change the underlying logic. Chandelure's Pokedex entries describe the fate of those whose souls it absorbs. The physical body continues. It does not die in any conventional sense. Instead, it wanders, described as moving without purpose, an empty form going through the motions of existing. The soul that animated it is now burning inside Chandelure, fuel for the chandelier's light. The image of bodies wandering purposelessly through the world while their essential selves burn decoratively inside a Pokemon chandelier is one of the most genuinely unsettling things the Pokedex is committed to in the series, offered without horror genre framing, described in the same neutral documentary tone used for every other entry. Axiu's tusks break and regrow throughout its life, and each regeneration produces tusks stronger than what was there before. The Pokedex treats this as a straightforward developmental feature, damage followed by stronger repair, the kind of adaptive response that makes biological sense in a creature that uses its tusks as primary tools. The progression toward Haxorus follows that logic, each stage arriving with tusks that have been through more breaking and regrowing, harder for it. Fracture's post-battle tusk polishing is one of the more specific behavioral details the generation gives to any Pokémon line. After every battle, before resting, Fracture sharpens and smooths its tusks against rocks. The ritual is described as something Fracture takes seriously. Not casual maintenance, but deliberate preparation for whatever comes next. The consistency of the behavior performed after every battle, without exception, gives Fracture a quality of discipline that reads as something like professionalism. Haxorus carries an enormous attack stat for a Pokémon that is not legendary, reflecting the accumulated strength of all those tusk breakages and regrowths. Its Pokedex notes that it is gentle in daily life and only shows the full extent of its power when genuinely threatened. The contrast between ordinary gentleness and extreme capability when provoked is a pattern that appears in multiple dragon-type Pokémon across the series. The idea that tremendous destructive power and ordinary calm can coexist in the same creature, with the calm being the default and the destruction being the response to specific circumstances. Cubchoo was designed with a feature that most creature designs avoid for obvious reasons. The large drop of mucus hanging from its nose is not incidental to the design. It is central. According to its Pokedex entries, the mucus is the source of Cubchoo's ice-type power, and the quality of the mucus serves as an indicator of health. A healthy Cubchoo has abundant, flowing mucus. A sick Cubchoo has thin, diminished mucus and correspondingly reduced battle effectiveness. The bodily fluid functions simultaneously as a power source and a health display, information about the creature's condition expressed through a detail that most designs would consider undignified. Beartic is Cubchoo grown, large and capable of existing in conditions that would be immediately inhospitable to most Pokémon. Its breath freezes the water vapor in the air around it, and it uses this to create solid footholds in the ocean when it needs to cross water in frozen environments. The ice it creates with its breath is functional, serving a purpose in the moment, rather than being decoration. Beartic makes what it needs from what its body produces, and what its body produces happens to be useful ice. Cryogonal presents a design that is unusual for an ice type, in that it lacks any clear animal inspiration. It is a snowflake, approximately, a geometric form given life, rather than an animal given frost. Its hunting method involves chains of ice crystals rather than physical contact, and its Pokedex describes it evaporating when temperatures rise, becoming water vapor and rejoining the atmosphere until conditions allow it to solidify again. The life cycle of condensation and evaporation embedded in cryogonal's biology gives it a relationship to weather that is more direct than most water or ice types achieve. It is not merely adapted to cold, it is composed of the same substance that cold produces. Stunfisk commits completely to a design built around a trap. It buries itself in mud until it is invisible, waits for something to step on it, and then delivers an electric shock to whatever has made contact with its body. Its expression when the trap is sprung is described as a smile. The contentment embedded in Stunfisk's face at the moment of delivering an electric shock to an unsuspecting passerby is a design detail that takes the trap concept and adds to it something like personality. Mienfoo arrived as a small and energetic fighting type whose design draws from the flowing, expansive movements of Chinese wushu rather than from the more compact and linear styles that informed earlier fighting types in the series. The difference between a Pokémon designed around karate and a Pokémon designed around wushu is visible in the silhouette, the extended lines, the sense of potential energy in the posture. Mianxiao translates that movement quality into attack capabilities, described as operating at speeds beyond visual tracking. The whip-like fur on its arms delivers strikes that researchers have not been able to observe directly, only infer from their results. Drotagon occupies a position in the dragon-type family that is slightly unusual. It has no secondary type, a pure dragon that arrived in a generation with an unusually large number of dragon types competing for attention. Its design, with a blue body and a bright red face, is striking in a way that makes it visually distinctive, the color contrast doing work that a more conventionally colored dragon would need additional design elements to accomplish. Its Pokedex entries describe a creature that cannot move if it gets too cold, dependent on sunlight to maintain its body temperature. The thermal dependency is a limitation that makes Drotagon feel more like a reptile than most dragon types, a creature whose capabilities are conditional on external conditions. Golette's origin is described in its Pokedex entries as artificial, and when ancient civilization created it for purposes their entries describe as protective without specifying what was being protected or from whom. The civilization itself is not named or described beyond the fact of its existence and its apparent capability to create life from earth and stone. Golett carries forward a mission whose original context has been entirely lost, moving through a world that has no memory of why it was made. Golurk is large enough and carries energy old enough that its Pokedex entries treat it as something between a constructed thing and a natural phenomenon. The seal on its chest is the containment mechanism for that energy, preventing it from acting beyond any intended scope. When the seal is removed, Golurk runs. The Pokedex does not specify where it runs to or what it does when it gets there. It simply describes the running as something that happens when the seal is gone, enormous and purposeful and beyond the capacity of anything nearby to stop. Pawniard follows its Bisharp with complete loyalty, participating in hunts directed from above, deferring to the decisions of the creature at the center of the hierarchy. What makes the Pawniard-Bisharp relationship worth noting is the mechanism by which the hierarchy can change. A Pawniard that defeats a Bisharp in battle earns the leadership position. The hierarchy is maintained by strength and changed by strength, a system that is both rigid and genuinely contestable. Bisharp leads its Pawniard into forests for hunting operations, and emerges from them afterward, having secured whatever it was hunting. The coordination of Pawniard under Bisharp's direction is described as precise enough to take down prey considerably larger than any individual member of the group. The collective capability exceeds what the individual components would suggest, a quality the Pokedex notes without apparent surprise. Bouffalant's afro, beyond its visual impact, serves a specific mechanical purpose. When Bouffalant charges and makes contact with a hard surface, the afro absorbs the energy of the impact before it reaches the creature's skull. Bouffalant can charge into a train without sustaining brain damage because its hair functions as a living helmet. The design gave an enormous afro to a buffalo Pokémon and then made the afro functional, which is a particular kind of design satisfaction. Ruffle is small and confrontational, a young eagle-adjacent creature whose Pokedex entries describe it as picking fights with anyone regardless of size difference. It challenges large and dangerous Pokémon without apparent concern for the outcome, driven by something its entries describe as a desire to grow strong through confrontation. The fighting before one is ready is presented as a developmental stage rather than a flaw, a creature for whom difficulty is the point rather than an obstacle to the point. Braviary is described as one of the most noble Pokémon in Unova. Its Pokedex entries say it fights through injuries that would cause other Pokémon to stop, that it carries fallen allies to safety before returning to continue fighting, and that it is chosen as a symbol of strength and pride by the people who know it. The cumulative picture is of a creature that has organized its entire existence around a code, a set of values about what counts as acceptable behavior in a confrontation that it adheres to regardless of outcome. Volibbe's bone ornamentation is described in its entries as something it needs to feel secure, wearing a skull around its lower body for comfort as much as protection. The particular vulnerability expressed by a small predatory bird that feels better with a bone wrapped around it is a detail that makes Volibbe's toughness feel qualified, a creature learning to become formidable from a starting point that includes genuine need for external reassurance. Mandibuzz nests in bones. The nest itself is constructed from bones, arranged carefully, and its young are raised in that structure. The use of the remnants of other creatures' lives to build the environment in which new life grows is a cycle the design commits to fully. Mandibuzz is not grim in its relationship with bones. It is practical. The bones are good building material, and Mandibuzz knows where to find them. Heatmore's tongue generates enough heat to melt through Durant's steel coating. This capability exists because Durant's steel coating evolved over many generations as a response to Heatmore's predation. The two species have been in an evolutionary relationship so long that each one's defining physical feature can only be fully understood in terms of the other. Durant is armored because of Heatmore. Heatmore's tongue burns at the specific temperature needed to defeat that armor. The escalation between them is ongoing and written into their bodies. Dino is described in its Pokedex as learning about its world primarily through biting it. It bites people, Pokemon, and objects indiscriminately, not from aggression, but from a need to gather information through contact. The biting as sensory exploration is a behavior documented consistently across Dino's entries, making it both a hazard and a learner, a creature whose method of understanding the world happens to involve teeth. Zwilus has two heads that do not get along. They fight over food, they pull in different directions when moving, they do not appear to coordinate their actions willingly. The internal conflict of Zwilus is not presented as distressing for the creature, but as simply the conditions in which it exists. Two heads attached to one body, competing rather than cooperating, getting through each day in disagreement. When it evolves into Hydreigon, the heads multiply rather than reconciling, but the final form functions with the kind of devastating competence that makes whatever arrangement the heads have reached clearly workable. Hydreigon's three heads all bite. The two that grew from its arms are described in its Pokedex as acting without the direction of any brain, because neither of the arm heads contains one. The central head presumably does the thinking, and the arm heads do the biting, a division of labor that emerges from the biology rather than from any deliberate coordination. The efficiency of a creature that can bite in three directions simultaneously while only having to think about what one of those directions is doing is, from a pure predation standpoint, notable. Larvesta is massive for a larva. Its size at that stage is unusual enough that its Pokedex entries note it specifically, a creature that takes a very long time to evolve and arrives at its final stage at level 59, one of the highest evolution levels in the series. The slowness of the development is matched by the scale of what it becomes. Volcarona is described in entries across multiple games as a creature that filled the sky with light during an ancient period when volcanic ash had blocked the sun. Whether the story is mythological or historical within the game's logic is left open, but the image it produces is of an insect Pokémon whose wings, made of fire, served as a substitute for the sun itself during a period when the sun could not be seen. Cobalian's gaze is described as capable of stopping any Pokémon in its tracks. Its Pokedex entries describe this as a pressure that hits simultaneously with eye contact, a psychic or force of will quality embedded in the way it looks at things. Beyond that, Cobalian's history with humans is described as adversarial. It has protected Pokémon from human persecution in the past and carries the memory of that history in its bearing, approaching both Pokémon and humans with the same evaluative attention, looking for whether strength and honor are present rather than giving either automatic trust. Terrakeon's history of action is more documented than its companions. Its Pokedex entries describe specific events: the destruction of a castle whose masters were persecuting Pokémon, the charge that brought down the stone walls. The castle no longer stands. Terrakeon is the reason. The specificity of the historical claim, identifying a particular event rather than describing general behavior, gives Terrakeon a more individual past than most legendaries carry. Viridian moves through battle with a speed and grace that its Pokedex entries describe as making opponents unable to track what they are seeing. The confusion produced by its movement is an active part of its combat strategy, the beauty of the motion serving a functional purpose. Viridian defeats opponents while they are still trying to understand what they are looking at. Tornadus, in its incarnate form, is described as unleashing wind powerful enough to tear up trees and cause property damage simply by passing through an area. The destruction is incidental to its movement, collateral to the fact of its presence. Tornadus does not seek to cause damage. It simply generates enough force that everything it passes by cannot remain the way it was. Thundurus leaves visual evidence of its passing in the landscapes it moves through. Lightning strikes and charred ground mark the path it traveled. Unlike Tornadus, whose damage comes from motion through space, Thundurus actively releases its electrical energy as it moves, dropping bolts into the earth with enough frequency that the countryside remembers it was there. The two legendaries of the pair both alter landscapes, but through different mechanisms and with different permanence. Landorus is described as bringing fertile soil wherever it travels, the wind carrying with it something that makes the ground more capable of supporting life. The relationship between the destruction Tornadus and Thundurus leave and the renewal Landorus brings is described in the mythology of the Unova region as a cycle rather than a sequence. Destruction and renewal are not opposites in that telling, but partners, one making space for the other in an ongoing rotation. Reshiram's tail is described as a fusion reactor, producing heat sufficient to distort the air around it. When it burns with purpose, the fire it produces can change weather patterns. Its design connects fire not to aggression, but to clarity, the flame as a source of illumination rather than destruction, something that reveals rather than consumes. The association of Reshiram with truth maps onto fire in this reading as the thing that makes things visible, the thing you cannot look directly at, but that shows you what is actually there. Zekrom generates electricity from the rotation of its tail generator, and the static it produces can reach levels that cause electrical storms. Its design connects electricity not to enlightenment, but to conviction, the charge that builds and holds rather than the flame that illuminates and moves on. Ideals in this framing are persistent, accumulating, building towards something. Where Reshiram's fire moves and changes, Zekrom's electricity charges and waits. Kyurem is cold in ways that the Pokedex entries quantify. The air around it drops to temperatures that are described as instantly fatal to any creature that comes close. Its body is hollow in places, the emptiness described as the absence of something that was once there. The cold is not simply a type characteristic, but a consequence of the hollowness, of being a vessel from which the contents have departed. The fusion forms of Kyurem in the sequel games allow it to reclaim some of what was lost, the emptiness filled temporarily, the cold slightly lessened by the return of what had been absent. Keldeo is young in the context of the Swords of Justice, and the entries describe it as still learning, still in the process of becoming the thing that others already are. Its resolute form, which requires it to have learned Secret Sword, represents a completed step in that becoming. The form change is not bestowed from outside. It is accessed from within through the acquisition of knowledge that the others already possess. Keldeo's transformation is self-achieved in a way that distinguishes it from evolutions triggered by items or trades. Meloetta's relic song is ancient enough that the lyrics have been forgotten. The melody remains. The song exists as pure music, stripped of meaning by time, carrying its function without its content. A being that transforms through a song whose words have been lost is one of the more poignant ideas embedded in a Generation 5 legendary. The transformation still works. The song still changes what Meloetta is. The words that once gave it meaning are simply no longer there. Genesect carries the modification that defines it as something distinct from every other fossil Pokémon in the series. It is not a revived creature returned to its original state. It is a creature from 300 million years ago that was found, reconstructed, and then altered. The cannon mounted on its back and the drives that change its signature move's type are additions, improvements by Team Plasma's estimation, and the Genesect that players encounter is both an ancient thing and a modified one simultaneously, its original nature carrying the changes made to it by people whose goals it did not choose. Audino's role in the Unova games extended beyond what its modest design might suggest. Its high base HP and its access to healing moves made it a sought-after training partner, and the experience points it offered when defeated were generous enough that entire routes in Unova became associated with seeking out rustling grass patches where Audino was more likely to appear. Players who wanted to level their teams efficiently learned to listen for the sound of that rustling. Audino became, for many players, less a Pokémon they thought about catching, and more a sound they learned to follow. Its Pokedex entries, meanwhile, describe a creature with medical intuition, able to understand the condition of any Pokémon by listening to its heartbeat through the feelers on its ears. The gentle healer, who became the preferred training target for ambitious players, is one of the more quietly ironic positions any Pokémon occupies in the memory of those who played these games. Conkeldurr's concrete blocks deserve more attention than they typically receive in discussions of its design. The blocks are not weapons in the conventional sense. They are not being wielded as clubs or thrown as projectiles. They are carried by a creature that uses them as walking supports, leaning on them the way an elderly person leans on a walking cane, and swinging them as extensions of its movement, rather than as separate tools. The concrete blocks are simultaneously the evidence of Conkeldurr's association with construction work, the structural support for its movement, and the weapons of its combat style. One object, serving three functions in the design of a single Pokémon, is efficient in a way that tends to characterize the more successful designs in the series. Sewaddle's arrival was unusual enough to be worth returning to. The official Pokémon page of Yahoo was not a venue that players expected to be the location of a first reveal for a new Pokémon. The platform choice felt accidental, a consequence of web infrastructure rather than a planned announcement, and the image that appeared there of a small bug wrapped in leaves generated confusion before it generated excitement. Players encountered Sewaddle's design in a context that gave it no framing, no trailer, no music, just an image on a website that was not primarily about Pokémon, and they had to work out what they were looking at. The Pokedex entries that arrived later described a Pokémon that makes its own leaf clothing and can sew leaves into new garments using the sticky thread it produces, a creature whose design activity is clothing construction. Leavenny extends the leaf clothing behavior into something more social. It makes clothing for the smaller Pokémon that share its environment, cutting and sewing leaf garments sized for Sewaddle using its bladed arms and the sticky thread. The behavior is described as something it does without being asked, noticing smaller creatures nearby and beginning the process of equipping them. The connection to Levana, the Roman goddess of newborns, carries through into Leavanny's behavior, a creature that clothes and protects the young and small without requiring gratitude or recognition. Whirlipede occupies an evolutionary middle stage that is worth noting for a specific reason. Its name references whirling, and its species designation is the Curlipede Pokémon, and the entries for Whirlipede describe a creature that curls into a ball and rolls at high speed when threatened. But the name Whirlipede also contains the word whirl, and whirling is the thing that Whirlipede actually does. Its species name describes a different action than its own name, which is either a minor design inconsistency or a deliberate choice to have the two names describe the same creature from two different angles, curled in the species designation and whirling in the name. Scolipede arrived as the largest bug-type Pokémon in the series at the time of its introduction, a measurement that combined with its poison-type designation to make it the heaviest poison type as well. The numbers attached to Scolipede, 8 feet 2 inches in height and 442 pounds of weight, are striking relative to its pre-evolutions, both of which are small and unassuming. The scale jump between Whirlipede and Scolipede is one of the more dramatic in the generation. A creature that was manageable, becoming something that shares more physical space with the player than almost any bug Pokémon before it. Lilligant's 4 post-evolution level-up moves are worth listing in the context they create. A creature that can only learn 4 moves through ordinary leveling after reaching its final form is a creature that has committed to a particular set of tools. Lilligant's moveset is narrow by necessity rather than by choice, and trainers who evolve Petilil too quickly discover this constraint at the moment when Lilligant can no longer grow in the direction they had expected. The design gives Lilligant elegance and limits simultaneously, the grace of its appearance offset by the specific discipline required in using it. Basculin's ability situation created a paper trail of corrections and version changes that made it one of the more complicated Pokémon to track through multiple game releases. The Blue Stripe form's ability changed between Black and White and Black and White 2, then changed again upon transfer between console generations. A single Pokémon whose abilities differed not just between its 2 forms, but between game versions and between transfer operations, represented a level of inconsistency that players who paid attention to such things found remarkable. The game offered 2 forms of the same Pokémon with divergent ability pools, and then added a third complication through the act of moving it from one game to another. Basculin is memorable for the mechanics around it more than for its design. Sandile's ground-dark typing was new to the series when it arrived. No prior Pokémon carried that combination. The typing gave the evolutionary line a particular identity, a desert creature adapted to concealment and ambush, the dark type suggesting cunning, and the ground type suggesting the sand and rock of the environments it inhabited. The type combination's uniqueness gave the line something to own within the type chart, a niche that was theirs and no one else's. Krokorok waited. The 62 episodes between its first appearance and its eventual capture represented a duration that no other Pokémon in the anime endured as a recurring character before finally joining the lead trainer's team. Krokorok appeared episode after episode as a wild Pokémon with a particular relationship to Ash, following him, watching him, challenging him, declining to be caught until the right moment had been sufficiently delayed. The patience of the wait, whether intentional on the part of the writers or a consequence of scheduling, produced something that felt like a genuine arc. Darumaka's cultural inspiration is as interesting as its Pokedex content. It is based on the Daruma doll, a traditional Japanese object associated with setting goals and achieving them. The Daruma doll is purchased with one eye blank. The owner paints in the first eye when they set a goal and the second eye when they achieve it. The doll is weighted at the bottom, so it always returns upright when knocked over, symbolizing persistence through difficulty. Darumaka's round, roly-poly appearance carries that design history and its evolution. Darmanitan continues the association with conviction and endurance, a creature whose internal fire is the literal expression of the doll's symbolic heat. Darmanitan's Zen mode, which it enters when it drops below half health, transforms it from a pure fire type into a fire and psychic type with an entirely different stat distribution. The transformation is triggered by damage, a creature that changes what it fundamentally is in response to being hurt, exchanging raw physical power for a calmer and more cerebral state. The Zen mode Darmanitan sits still and attacks psychically, while its normal form moves fast and hits hard. The same creature occupies two completely different tactical roles, depending on how the battle has gone. Maractus cannot avoid the sandstorm in the only place it lives. That fact deserves to simply be held for a moment. The desert resort is where Maractus lives. The desert resort has a permanent sandstorm. Maractus takes damage from sandstorm. Maractus lives in a permanent sandstorm that is always hurting it. The question of why Maractus chooses to live in the sandstorm, or whether the sandstorm arrived after Maractus was already there, or whether Maractus's biology is more resistant to sandstorm damage than the type chart suggests, is left entirely to the player to resolve. The game offers no explanation. Dwebble carries its home carved from rock rather than from a shell, and when its preferred rock is unavailable, it becomes agitated in ways its Pokedex documents with concern. The preference for rock over shell distinguishes it from the hermit crabs it is visually related to, and the agitation at being without its preferred material adds a layer of specificity to its character. Dwebble has opinions about what kind of home is acceptable, and those opinions are documented. Crustle builds its final form house from multiple boulders that it cements together into a single large structure. The weight of the house is described as something Crustle manages without apparent difficulty, its strength sufficient to carry the load as normal locomotion. The house travels with Crustle because Crustle carries it, and the house is not a shell in the biological sense, but a constructed object that the Pokémon has made and maintained. The line between a creature and its environment dissolves in Crussle's design, the shelter becoming part of the creature. Scrafty's anime debut in the Latin American dub preserved a moment that became notable within the fan community that discovered it. The improvised reference to Digimon from the voice actor playing Meowth represents a small rupture in the usual boundaries between franchises, a moment when a performer's spontaneity produced something that was broadcast to viewers in a different language than the original. The line is in the recording. It was not corrected. People in the region who watched Pokémon saw a Pokémon character use a competitor's franchise name, and it happened because someone found the moment funny and committed to the improvisation. Sigilif's design draws from ancient Mesoamerican art and the imagery of petroglyphs, images carved or painted onto rock surfaces by early human cultures. The mystery of petroglyph imagery, which often involves figures that viewers have interpreted as depicting encounters with something beyond ordinary experience, connects to Sigilif's designation as an ancient guardian of lost cities. Its design suggests something that has been watching for a very long time. A creature whose shape was captured in rock art and then came to life in a place where the art is still visible. Yamask's mask is its own face. The Pokedex entries are specific about this. The mask that every Yamask carries, wherever it goes, is the face it had when it was a human being, before it became what it is now. The entries note that looking at the face in the mask sometimes causes Yamask to weep. The grief of a creature carrying the literal face of a former life is a detail the series offers without softening. A ghost Pokémon whose haunting is personal rather than territorial, directed inward toward its own history rather than outward toward those who intrude on its space. Cofagrigus is a haunted sarcophagus, a Pokémon whose body resembles an ornate Egyptian coffin and who lures people close to swallow them. Its Pokedex entries describe gold grave robbers being drawn to its golden surface and then consumed, stored inside its body. The design connects it to Egyptian burial traditions and to the consequences of disturbing what has been laid to rest, a creature that has become the guardian of ancient things by becoming an ancient thing itself. Tortuga's possible earlier appearance in a 1997 magazine cover is one of those historical footnotes that rewards attention to the long arc of the series. The image in question appeared during the announcement period for Gold and Silver, at a moment when the next generation of Pokémon was being introduced to the world. A creature resembling what would eventually become Tortuga appearing in that context suggests either that design ideas were circulating that early, or that convergent design evolution within the series produced similar results independently across a gap of more than a decade. Caracosta's connection to a Shia LaBeouf internet meme through its Super Mystery Dungeon dialogue is one of those moments where official Pokémon documentation intersects with internet culture in a way that timestamps the reference precisely. The meme it references was at its peak in a particular window, and the presence of the quote in an official game localization connects that moment to the franchise in a way that is unlikely to be replicated for the same reason, because the specific moment the meme occupied has passed. Caracosta will always have that line, and it will always be a document of when it was written. There are places in every generation where the full weight of what has been created becomes apparent only in looking at everything together. The 156 Pokémon of Unova did not arrive quietly. They arrived as a statement, a deliberate choice to begin the story again from the very first moment, to offer a world built entirely from new creatures without any familiar faces standing in the background for comfort or reassurance. The designers of Black and White believed that players could find their way into something new, and they were correct, though the transition was not without its discomforts. What Unova offered in place of the familiar was specificity. Each creature carried a very particular meaning, a very particular origin, a very particular relationship with some idea or tradition or observation that the design team had chosen to build upon. The specificity of Unova's Pokémon is part of what makes them memorable, even now. They feel deliberate. They feel intended. The way facts accumulate about a place like Unova is itself a kind of portrait of that place, taken one by one. A fact about Victini's ears, or a fact about Samurot's cry, is small and isolated, but laid alongside each other, these facts begin to describe not just individual creatures, but a collective sensibility, a way of approaching design that ran through the entire generation. Unova was interested in duality, Reshiram and Zekrom, Rufflet and Vullaby, Heatmore and Durant, Zorua's illusions, and the reality those illusions concealed. The generation organized itself around pairs of things in conversation, in opposition, in dependency, more consistently than most generations before it. Even the games themselves, Black and White, organized around a version pairing that was more thematically integrated than previous pairs had been. The legendary Pokémon, not simply different exclusives, but philosophical counterparts, truth and ideals. What is versus what could be? The tension between those two orientations ran through the games at every level, from the legendary pair at its center to the small moments in which players chose which path to follow. There is something worth sitting with in that design intention. A generation of Pokémon that was explicitly about the difference between truth and ideals is a generation that was asking its players, many of whom were young, to hold two things that are not always in agreement, and to understand that the choice between them is rarely simple. The Pokémon themselves carry that complexity. Reshiram burns with truth. Zekrom charges with the energy of conviction. Kyurem sits in the cold place, where those two things have not yet been reconciled. The emotional and philosophical architecture of Unova's legendary trio is something that rewards returning to with older eyes. As the words grow lighter and the space between thoughts expands, the region of Unova becomes something less specific and more atmospheric, a place where Swana dance before the sun arrives, where Kupchu wander through cold air, where Golurk stands in a landscape that has forgotten what it was made for, where Meloetta sings a song whose words no one any longer knows. These are not alarming things. They are simply things, the world of Unova, held gently in the distance that sleep creates. Unova brought 156 entirely new creatures into the world at once, with nothing familiar alongside them to soften the transition. It asked players to start again without the comfort of what they already knew. That choice produced something unusual, a region that stands apart in memory, that carries its own particular atmosphere, that introduced ideas and creatures and designs that continue to appear and reappear in conversations about what Pokémon can be. The creatures of Unova arrived in a particular order, and that order told a story. From Victini's luminous zero to Genesect's augmented memory, the region traced an arc from hope to inquiry, from small warmth to ancient mystery. Each creature along the way carried something worth knowing, a name built from unexpected words, a design borrowed from a real animal or an ancient tradition, a detail in its Pokedex that revealed how much thought had been given to a creature that might be encountered only once, in a patch of grass on the way to somewhere else. What makes these facts restful, perhaps, is not their complexity, but their care. Behind each one is someone who thought about it, who decided that Duwat's name should contain a reference to a samurai novelist, who placed the word Yankee inside a monkey's Japanese name, who built Archeops so that 3 separate counting systems would arrive at the same number. The attention given to small things in Pokemon's design has always been one of the qualities that makes the series feel like it was made by people who loved what they were doing. The region of Unova was imagined as a place that stood apart. The Pokemon that live there carry that spirit of distinction. They are not the creatures of another place. They were made specifically for this one, for these routes and these cities and these seasons. Their stories are the stories of a place that asked what it might mean to begin completely fresh, to offer a world made entirely of new things, and to trust that players would find within it something worth returning to. The quietest facts about Unova are perhaps the ones about duration. How long Krokorok waited, how many episodes separated Ashes caught Palpitoad from what came before it, how many years passed between a magazine image and Tirtuga's official arrival. Time runs through these details in a way that makes the region feel lived in, accumulated, built from decisions made across a long span of careful work. As the words become lighter and the details begin to blur at their edges, let the shapes of Unova move through the space behind your eyes without demanding anything. Minccino tidying the floor of a room, Swana dancing in the early morning water, the blue and red stripes of Basculin moving through a cold current, Golurk standing still in a place where everything around it has long since ended, Meloetta choosing which form it needs tonight. These are the creatures of Unova, patient and particular, carrying their small histories with them wherever they go. Let these facts rest where they have landed. The silhouette of Victini's ears, the length of Samurot's cry, the German name of a small fire pig, the ancient word hidden inside Leovani's name, the absence of a weakness in Electros, the moment when a Scrafty was called a Digimon in a different language. Small things, held carefully, carrying more meaning than their size suggests. If you find yourself drifting toward sleep, there's another video waiting for you when you return, ready to carry you gently through whatever night comes next. For now, let these gentle facts carry you there. The region of Unova is quiet tonight, and all 156 of its creatures are settled in the places they belong.